In 1973, a New Hampshire woman would start banging on the door of a rural home in the middle of the night. When residents Mr. and Mrs. Bowden finally answered the door, they would be stunned to see a hysterical, sobbing woman begging to be let in. After some time, the young woman would tell the couple a UFO had just stalked her and tried to take her. In this episode, we will dive into this frightening case, one that will make you think about driving down remote roads in the middle of the night. This story has come to be known as the 1973 Goffstown Incident. On Friday, November 2nd, 1983, around 2:45 a.m., Linda Morell clocked out of work at the Swedish sauna in Manchester, New Hampshire. Linda talked with a coworker and decided to drive and meet for coffee at Roy's restaurant on South Willow Street. The two talked for around 45 minutes and then departed, each going their separate ways. Linda stopped to get gas and then proceeded on Route 114A toward her home. As she drove out of the city, her attention would soon turn toward a bright yellow light up to the left. Linda didn't think too much of it, and being very tired, did her best to ignore it. As she kept looking at it though, she knew it must be something. Very soon it started flashing red, green, and blue colors. While she initially thought it could be a planet, right next to it she could see the planet Mars, and the UFO was significantly brighter. Linda would travel about a mile and notice the light hadn't changed positions but was much brighter. Then all of a sudden the bright light would go out. At this point, Linda believed there was a strong possibility that this was a UFO, as she knew it couldn't be a planet. After about a minute, the light came back on once again, in the same position. The UFO would continue to do this for the next 10 to 15 minutes, appearing and disappearing. During this time, Linda saw several cars pass her by, and some speculate that the craft might have been disappearing in order to avoid detection by other vehicles. Some think it could have been a mechanical problem. At this point, Linda was on the outskirts of Goffstown. As she continued on Route 114, she would crest a hill and be stunned to see the craft right up ahead. It was much lower now, and the light much brighter. According to Linda, the craft appeared to be an orange and gold globe, completely covered with a honeycomb design of hexagons, except for a window that was oval-shaped. The window's color was paler and located on the upper left portion of the object. The craft was relatively small compared to other UFOs, being only around the size of a large car. Linda then noticed flashes of red, green, and blue coming from a source in the center, and they were switching back and forth. Even more bizarre, a steady, high-pitched whine was emitted by the object, and not only could she hear the sound, but she felt it throughout her body as a tingling sensation. Initially, Linda was amazed at what she was seeing, but her feelings would quickly turn to panic. Strangely, she began gripping the steering wheel extremely tight and couldn't let go for some reason. She would report her eyes were being pulled toward the craft, as if something was trying to take control of her. Unlike many other cases, there were no issues with the car's engine or electrical systems. At this point, the car was moving quickly toward the craft, and Linda would speculate it was being pulled by the UFO. She would later state it was like her car was being pulled like a magnet. Even more frightening during this time, for around half a mile, Linda couldn't really recall what happened during the stretch. She stated that her eyes remained on the UFO, but she has no memory of actually driving. Linda did point out it could just be the case she was in shock and did it subconsciously. As she got even closer to the craft, at this point she was only a few hundred feet away. Here, she would notice a figure in the upper left-hand window. She could see the being's head, upper body, and arms were visible above a dark horizontal surface which covered the lower portion of the oval window. The legs were not visible. Behind the humanoid was some sort of white background. The being's body was gray, and it seemed like it was a darker shade of gray than the face. The entity had a round head and large egg-shaped eyes that wrapped around it. In general, it fit the description of a gray alien, except it had a peculiar detail. Lindia would report it had wrinkles or loose skin, a feature reported from time to time, but usually not with gray encounters. She couldn't say for sure whether the being wore a uniform, but speculated that it did. It had a slit for a mouth and no ears or nose. It's possible, though, that she missed it. Still, what caught her attention the most were the eyes. They seemed to mesmerize her, and she fell into some sort of trance-like state, unable to look away from them. In looking in them, she said the being might have spoke to her telepathically and assured her it would be okay. For a few moments, she reported a sense of calm, and while she couldn't be certain it communicated, she sensed she would be okay. Then suddenly, Lindia woke up from her trance. She realized everything that was happening and immediately began to panic, realizing the UFO might just take her. She took control of the car and began speeding down the road faster, past the cemetery and ending up at the Bowden house. She knew the household because Lindia was only 3/4 of a mile from her home. She jumped out of the car, leaving it running, and started running toward the door. The UFO changed positions and kept following her, with its buzzing sound growing louder. As she started running up to the door, the family German Shepherd ran at Lindia, growling. Lindia, who was normally scared of dogs, smacked the German Shepherd across the face and hysterically ran to the front door. She started banging, and after around 2 minutes, the couple came down. Lindia grabbed onto Mr. Bowden and stated, "Help me! I'm not drunk. I'm not on drugs. A UFO just tried to pick me up." What happened next was very strange. According to Miss Bowden, she said the witness was covering her ears, complaining about a sound. However, neither she nor her husband remembered hearing anything. Lindia would later recall that after a few minutes in the home, the sound would go away. She also stated during this time there would be a tingling sensation that would dissipate as well. The couple at this time would call the police. It was now 4:30 a.m. and soon Goffstown patrolman Daniel Jubenville, age 23, arrived. Once he got there, the four headed outside and would spot a strange light in the sky. When he shined his flashlight in the direction of the light, it would turn off. Oddly, the young officer would state that the light probably was Mars, even though it appeared to be turning on and off. They headed back in, and Officer Jubenville took down notes on Lindia's story, and although it was tough to believe, Daniel would note that Lindia was not under the influence. All this said, what can we make of her story? In general, there are two theories surrounding her case. The first is that she confused either a planet or something else, became frightened, and then perhaps being embarrassed, made up that she had seen a UFO. Skeptics point out she was looking in the same direction as the planet, and also being late at night, isolated, she might have become frightened on the dark, desolate roads. Still, this doesn't really explain why the light turned off and on and was witnessed by 4 separate individuals. Surely planets and stars don't do this, and being back in the 70s, it wasn't a satellite either. This leads to the second theory, which is that she spotted a UFO. It seems like this craft was targeting her, perhaps because she was in a remote area. It's not evident that she was taken, although it could have occurred. Still, we see things in her case we see all too often. The first is the beings, even being far away, seem to be able to put her in a trance-like state. This is reported time and time again in cases, and Lindia seemed to be under their spell. Interestingly, she was able to break from it, and perhaps the beings were unable to fully hypnotize her. The second thing we saw in this case that happens often is the witness had their encounter in a dark, remote area. Many close encounters happen when no one is around, and often on isolated roads. It seems obvious the beings want to stay in the shadows, but why and for what reason is anyone's guess. Lindia, like many, was followed in the middle of the night and approached when no other vehicles were around. One interesting aspect of this case has to do with the craft and the being. The craft was certainly unusual, appearing in a honeycomb form and also being pretty small. In addition to this, the being spotted seemed to look like a stereotypical gray alien. Lindia stated, though, that it had wrinkles, which doesn't fit the normal description. That's not incredibly unusual, but something a little odd. It should be pointed out greys are widely believed to be the worker bees in the alien hierarchy. They are thought to be the biological robots given commands to perform specific tasks. Some don't believe this, but many cases seem to point in this direction. Should we believe Lindia's story? In general, it seems pretty credible, although the evidence is not overwhelming. She was not under the influence of drugs or alcohol, nor did she seek to gain fame. In addition, others witnessed the light, albeit they didn't seem as concerned. This could clearly be chalked up to the distance, though it was, and also the fact it was so late at night. The Bowdens probably wanted to head back to sleep, and the officer probably wanted to get back to the station. After this event, it doesn't appear that Lindia had any other alien encounters or saw any other UFOs in her life. In 1976, country singer Johnny Sands was in Las Vegas, Nevada, promoting his latest record. Sands was a pretty accomplished country singer, appearing on the Today Show, and also singing in shows with country music legends like Charlie Daniels and Merle Haggard. In addition to this, Sands also worked as a stuntman, magician, and escape artist. However, there would be no escape from what came for him. In January 1976, his case is considered quite credible, as hundreds would see UFOs in the sky that night, and Sands would pass a polygraph as well. In this episode, we will examine this close encounter of the third kind, the case of Johnny Sands. On January 29th, 1976, Johnny Sands hopped in his car leaving Las Vegas so he could drive and promote his record and also explore some older western towns. After a long day, Sands left the town of Pahrump, located about an hour outside of Las Vegas, and began heading home around 10 p.m. Sands hopped on the Blue Diamond Road, and around 10:30 p.m. he would spot a strange craft in the sky. He was pretty preoccupied at the moment though, thinking about his music, and initially ignored the craft. The craft would then follow him for around 3 miles, when suddenly his engine started sputtering, and he pulled over on the shoulder. He started checking the car, making sure he wasn't out of gas, or there wasn't a problem with the engine, and at that moment, forgot completely about the UFO. Then, Johnny Sands would see something he would never forget. Around 1,000 feet in the air, Sands spotted the craft. It was around 60 feet long, oval-shaped, and had a burnt orange color. As well, it had a large ring around it. In the ring, there were portholes around 10 feet in diameter and around 5 feet apart. Between each porthole, there was a light and lights on the end, flashing white. The craft moved over a nearby mountain, lighting up the entire area. At this point, Sands was pretty scared and decided to get back to work, fixing his car. He tried removing several things and inspecting them, but had no luck. Then he turned back around, and he spotted several humanoids in his headlights down the road. In a frightening turn of events, Sands froze and couldn't move. It appears the beings had paralyzed him. The beings then approached, with one coming around 3 feet away, while the other stopped at about 5 feet. The beings were around 5'8", 140 pounds, and looked incredibly strange. Sands would state that these pale creatures had something on the sides of their face that resembled gills. Even more odd, the gills seemed to move incredibly quickly on their face. They were bald, with no eyebrows, and had small black eyes with white pupils, and also had a flat nose, which Sands would compare to a pug's nose. The skin was extremely wrinkled, something we see in other cases like this. The beings wore silver coveralls that had a white strap that ran from their shoulder to their waist. They also had another belt around their waist with different types of gadgets on them. What happened next would truly be shocking. A conversation would ensue, with Sands asking some questions and the beings asking some as well. They communicated through telepathy. It's important to note at the time the APR report was written, the beings would threaten Sands, saying if he revealed the whole conversation of which occurred, they would come for him. In a later interview with Brent Rains, around 30 years later, Sands would reveal the details he was asked not to discuss. According to Sands, for around a 10-minute period, the beings in Sands would communicate, with Sands asking the first question, "Where did you come from?" The beings pointed up to the sky and didn't say a word. The being would then ask Sands what he was doing there. Sands responded he was in Las Vegas and doing a record, and that he was a country music singer. The creature then asked, why were so many people in Las Vegas? Sands stated it was a tourist town and that people came to Las Vegas from all over. Sands was then asked, what is your means of communication? He didn't understand the question really. The being seemed to become angry and stated, answer the question. Once again though, a frightened Sands repeated that he didn't understand the question. The humanoid turned to the other at this point, and the beings seemed to be communicating something to one another, although it's not clear what. This lasted 2 to 3 minutes. It should be pointed out once again the beings' mouths didn't move, and they communicated with Sands through telepathy. The beings then turned around and warned Sands once again about seeing them, stating, don't say anything about this meeting. We know where you are, and we'll see you again. In the interview with Brent Rains in 2009, Sands would state the being pulled out a small ball that grew into the size of a basketball and had sparks flying all around it. Next, the being said, you see, nuclear explosions are causing a problem in the solar system. These things that you're setting off on this Earth are causing troubles not only for you, but for us, and we cannot have this kind of thing to continue because it's going to upset the balance of everything that we intend for the future. Sands was confused as he was an entertainer and didn't know almost anything about the topic. He next asked if the beings were evil, to which it responded, harm comes from evil. Sands would ask their age, to which the creature responded, we are before the beginning of what you know as time. The being would go on to say they would see him again in time, and he would understand the reason. It doesn't appear that the beings kept their promise, as the 2009 interview with Brent Rains didn't reveal further contact. After the 10-minute conversation, they walked off into the night, and a white flash lit up the sky. The beings then disappeared. After this, Sands went to the Air Force Base in the area and was referred to the APRO. There he would converse with John Romero, who would ask him to take a polygraph. At the time, Sands was in a bit of a predicament. Hundreds, possibly thousands, saw strange lights that night, and word was circling around town around his experience. Sands didn't want people to think his story was all a publicity stunt and had to manage telling his story along with also promoting his record. Eventually, the APRO would arrange for him to take a polygraph with Dr. R.L. Nolan and pass. Dr. Nolan was an FBI agent with over 27 years of experience administering the test. One interesting thing did happen in the test though. The test showed that Sands was holding back something. It's important to point out he was not lying. For decades, Johnny would not talk about some of the things the beings asked him not to discuss. Decades later, according to Johnny Sands, the beings would tell him that night that the governments and militaries around the world were aware of their existence. It's important to note the beings didn't say what the relationship was between the two. What can we make of this incredible close encounter of the third kind? There's quite a bit to unpack from this case. Probably the first thing to note here is that the being's appearance was definitely strange and not the typical gray or Nordic alien. That said, there are other cases with people reporting very wrinkly beings, and of course many cases of entities warning about the dangers of nuclear weapons. There's quite a bit of supporting evidence, even though Sands was all alone. Many saw a UFO or lights in the Las Vegas area in the sky that night. Also, Sands passed a lie detector, and his story was considered credible by the APRO. In addition to this, Sands had a lot to lose, as he was doing well, and this could sink his career. Some debate this though, as he was an entertainer, and didn't have a career like a politician, which relied on reputation. One other similarity as well with the other cases we see is his car dying without reason. We see this time and time again. Still though, in examining the APR report versus the 2009 Rains interview, there does appear to be minor discrepancies. First, in the Rains interview, Johnny stated that the being spoke through telepathy. However, in the APRO report, it seems to imply the being's words came through them, like as if it was coming out of their bodies. It's important to note that the APRO report stated the entities did not move their mouths, and we might be misinterpreting the communication method in the report. One other thing to point out, there was no mention or worries around nuclear programs in the original APRO report. It's pretty well known in 2009 that ETs are concerned over nuclear weapons based on numerous reports. In all fairness, he may have been told to not discuss this though. Sands also stated he underwent hypnosis in the 2009 interview, but the APRO bulletin stated he did not and was afraid of hypnosis. Once again though, he might have done hypnosis later on. Later, Johnny appeared to have some run-ins with the Men in Black. He stated on one occasion a man told him the gills from the beings were because the beings were semi-aquatic. The strange man would tell him that these beings were from around the star Sirius. Why was Johnny selected to meet the beings? There was never a reason given to him. However, we speculate that Johnny's heritage may have been a factor. Johnny Sands is a Native American, and perhaps with a culture very spiritual in nature, one of his ancestors had contact with the beings. Johnny Sands was no ordinary man. He worked as a stuntman, escape artist, singer, and much more. In 1983, he broke the world record for the fastest straitjacket escape artist in the world with a record speed of 79 hundredths of a second. In 2004, he stayed in a stainless steel glass topped casket that was submerged under 600 gallons of water and appeared at fairs throughout the eastern United States. He was inducted into the Houdini Hall of Fame in Niagara Falls. As a stuntman, he performed over 15,000 movie stunts, being in movies with legends like Elvis. Despite this, his night in Vegas in January 1976 would be the most significant event of his life. He still goes and stares at the sky, looking for the beings, and talks out loud, asking them to return and talk with him. Maybe one day he will speak with them once again. It is theorized by some that alien-human hybridization programs have been happening for decades. Many believe that thousands, perhaps millions of alien abductions reported are somehow tied to this, while some speculate these beings might just be curious, such as a marine biologist tagging a shark. Others believe that the beings' intentions are much more nefarious. Some have speculated that these entities are creating a human-alien hybrid race that will eventually take over the planet. While the theory sounds ludicrous on the surface, there are interesting facts around these abductions that lend support to this theory. For example, we know many women alien abductees are abducted throughout their lives, and then the abductions seem to cease around their mid-40s, coincidentally around the same time as they are unable to have more children. In this episode, we will dive into a disturbing case of one woman's repeated abduction stories, the case of Terry Matthews. In 1970 in Paris, Illinois, Terry Matthews, then 22 years old, was driving home one evening when she would have an experience that would change her life forever. As Terry drove, she glanced off to the right and saw a gorgeous sunset on a crystal clear day. Then, bizarrely, in the next moments, the scenery around her suddenly changed. It was now very dark, and she found herself driving in a violent thunderstorm. She could barely see in front of her, and even more strange, it seemed as if something was pulling her car off to the right. For the next minute or so, she battled this invisible force, trying to keep her car on the road. Then, in an instant, a white flash appeared, the rain and storm stopped, and a confused Terry pulled over on the shoulder. She had no idea what had just happened. Terry was not injured in any way, but extremely confused over what had just happened to her. She got back on the road and began driving home. As she arrived home, Terry would be stunned to discover that she was over 2 hours late. Expected to be home at 8, it was now 10 p.m., and a confused Terry could not account for what had happened to her during those 2 hours. For years, Terry would continue to experience strange and frightening events in her life. She had strange bruises on her body and also other cases of missing time. She also saw several UFOs and nightmares so intense she believed them to be a memory of something. In sum, after much time, she came to the conclusion that she had been abducted by aliens. She couldn't recall much of what had happened to her though, and believed the beings had wiped her memory. Regardless, she wanted the truth, and Terry reached out to veteran UFO investigator David Jacobs. Jacobs was intrigued by Terry's story and suggested that hypnotic regression could possibly unlock some of these repressed memories. Jacob did warn her, though, that this could traumatize her and there would be no coming back once the memories were unlocked. Terry decided to press on, and Jacobs decided they should begin by trying to discover what happened on that drive home in 1970. As the hypnosis got underway, Terry would soon reveal that the weather drastically changed. She went on to say she pulled over the car, looked out the window, and saw a massive UFO that was silver colored. Then up ahead, Terry recalled seeing 6 gray aliens walking toward her. A terrified Terry jumped out of the car and ran, but as she started running away, she was suddenly hit with a bright white light. The next thing Terry recalled was being inside the spaceship. Things would go from bad to worse for Terry here. The beings told her to undress and also remove all her jewelry. She laid down and the beings would inform her that she was pregnant. According to Terry, they would take her baby and replace it with another one. It's not clear what happened to the baby that was put inside her womb. Terry did have children, but based on our research, it seems like this occurred after these events. As for the baby inside her womb, we speculate that the baby was a hybrid and taken from her. As the regressions continue, they became extremely traumatic for Terry. She recalled seeing her children on board the craft several times. This was especially difficult for her, knowing the trauma they were going through. Terry began to start recording herself sleeping around this time, and according to her, this appeared to have stopped the abductions. 3 years after the first hypnotic session was done, Jacobs and Terry would revisit what happened on that first encounter. Surprisingly, Terry was able to recall more from that night. More specifically, Terry recalled seeing a hybrid woman carrying a baby. She didn't look right to Terry, as she had big eyes and looked angry. Terry would go on to say the woman was holding a baby and put it in her arms, telling her that it was hers. Terry didn't believe them, as this baby was different. First, it looked very frail, and its skin didn't match that of a human baby, appearing pink with shades of gray. Also, its eyes were much bigger than a usual human baby, similar to the woman's. Terry would also describe the baby's eyes as wise, as the baby appeared to be cognizant as to what was going on, unlike a human baby at that age. Terry also noted it didn't behave like a human baby, as it didn't curl up to be held. It's important to note here that Terry had children and was familiar with caring for an infant. One final thing Terry noted was that when they pulled the baby away, Terry was overwhelmed with loss, and as a mother, she knew that that baby was hers. What can we make of Terry's story? Unfortunately, the story lacks any hard evidence or other witnesses, as it's based solely on Terry's statements and hypnotic regression. That said, it surely seems like this event could have happened to Terry, and her case has several interesting aspects to it The first is generational abductions. Simply stated, UFO researchers have found a disturbing trend where if someone is abducted, usually a parent or child, or both, are taken as well. This happened to Terry in her story, and there are several theories as to why this happens. One is that there's something in the genetic makeup that these beings want or need. There's different schools of thought on this, with some believing that certain bloodlines are better for developing hybrid beings. A second theory is that certain genetic traits make abductees easier to take. Some speculate that certain genes make people more easy to hypnotize and wipe their memories. The second interesting thing this case covers is the alien-human hybridization program. Many believe that these entities are taking people for the purpose of creating a hybrid species. Jacobs himself has investigated several interesting cases in which abductees have reported having to teach hybrid children how to act human and blend into society. This includes things like going shopping, basic social interactions, and blending in. These cases are particularly interesting and something we will explore in future episodes. While a good number of UFO researchers believe a hybrid program is underway and has been for a long time, it raises a number of questions, such as why? What's the endgame? David Jacobs has proposed that the true purpose behind these alien abductions is to create an alien-human hybrid race, one that will, in time, take over the planet undetected. Jacobs refers to this as a backdoor method, essentially meaning that when we finally discover what's happening, it will be too late and hybrids will be implanted throughout society. This concept was used in the 2013 TV show V, as the being's intentions were nefarious and they placed people in positions of power around the world. While Jacobs certainly has a terrifying perspective on this, many others feel that the being's purpose is not as malicious. Some suggest that these beings just want to understand human society and go out of their way, even not to traumatize people. They suggest that the memory wipes are done so that people won't have to live with the trauma. The medical experiments are done to understand us, and since they have the technology to perform these experiments and not damage us physically, they use it. As for hybrids, some feel that they are curious and want to experience our society. What one believes, though, is really a matter of opinion, as we simply don't know. That said, we know people are being taken, and that there seem to be a good number of medical procedures revolving around reproduction and reproductive systems. After years of hypnotic regressions with Jacobs, Terry would note that the abductions had stopped or significantly declined. By all accounts, Terry was able to move on and live a healthy and happy life. On prior episodes on this channel, we have examined numerous cases of pilots encountering UFOs and meeting their demise. On Saturday, October 21st, 1978, Australian pilot Frederick Valentich was on a 125-mile training flight when he notified air traffic control of a strange object. After several gargled transmissions, he was never heard from again. On January 7th, 1948, a United States Air Force pilot named Thomas Pantel would perish after chasing an unidentified flying object in the sky. In this episode, we will cover another such case in which the pilot chased a UFO over Lake Superior. He, nor his plane, were ever found. In time, this event has come to be known as the 1953 Kinross Incident. On the night of November 23rd, 1953, a U.S. Air Force F-89 jet fighter being piloted by First Lieutenant Felix Eugene Moncla and Second Lieutenant Robert L. Wilson was dispatched from Kinross Air Force Base in Michigan to investigate an unknown object that had been tracked on radar. The jet took off at 11:23 p.m., and at the time, the unidentified flying object was 160 miles northwest of Kinross Air Force Base. As the F-89 jet took off toward the object, ground control radioed the pilots that the UFO had shifted course, indicating the craft was aware the fighter jet was coming toward it. As Mancho and Wilson headed toward the craft, Wilson would begin to have difficulty tracking the UFO. He radioed ground control and notified them, and air traffic controllers would direct the pilots of the object's coordinates. For around 30 minutes, the fighter jet tracked the object, which would move further and further out over Lake Superior. At this point, Mancho and Wilson were gaining ground and catching up to the UFO, flying at an altitude of around 30,000 feet. At some point, the men made their last radio call, and air traffic control operators at ground control watched nervously as the fighter jet flew right to the UFO. Eventually, the blip of the fighter jet moved directly onto the blip from the UFO. As the two blips merged on screen, air traffic control initially believed that the fighter jet had flown directly over the craft and they would diverge in moments. The jet had flown in at 30,000 feet and then proceeded into a steep descent around 8,000 feet. This would not be the case though. As several more beeps passed, the single blip disappeared entirely from the screen. Operators believed that their equipment had malfunctioned, and air traffic control kept trying to radio the two men, but with no luck. After several more minutes, panic began to set in, and air traffic control sent an emergency message to search and rescue, giving the last known position of the jet, which was around 70 miles off Kiowa Point in Upper Michigan. Search and rescue and others would head to the last known position, and after searching all night, nothing would be found. There was no wreckage, no oil slick, or other debris. In the days that followed, more searches were done by the military and civilian parties. The plane, still, was never found. In time, military officials and others would try and sweep the event under the rug. Officials at Norton Air Force Base Flying Safety Division made an official statement saying that the pilot probably suffered from vertigo and crashed into the lake. They would go on to say the UFO was a Canadian DC-3 plane. It's important to note here that Canadian officials stressed none of their aircraft were in the vicinity at the time. In response to this, the Air Force stated that the plane had exploded at a high altitude. However, this explanation didn't make much sense, because if it had exploded in this manner, it would be very likely that search and rescue would have found debris. Before diving into the incident, it's important to understand some basics around Lake Superior. It is the largest freshwater lake in the world, yet it is not in the top 20 in terms of depth. With an average depth of 500 feet and a top depth around 1,300, the lake, relatively speaking, is not that deep. This is an important number to know as we dive into the theories in the search and rescue effort. In addition, we will cover claims by a diving company that alleges to have found the plane. The primary theory on this is that the fighter jet encountered a UFO. What happened next, though, has been hotly debated for centuries. The first theory is the fighter jet simply collided with the UFO. Proponents of this state that the jet lost control and flew right into the craft. The UFO perhaps wasn't expecting the jet to fly directly at it and was caught off guard. As they collided, both crafts fell into the lake and sunk toward the bottom. While this is a popular theory, it does have some obvious weaknesses. Why would the UFO allow itself to be a sitting duck? It seemed to obviously know that the jet was coming. In addition, a wreck like this would surely leave debris in an oil field out in the lake. This leads to the second theory. The UFO simply blasted the jet when it got too close and then disappeared. This explains how the jet went missing and lost communication. It also makes sense on many levels that a UFO would do this rather than just let a fighter jet collide with it. We know these craft are capable of avoiding radar detection, and this could have simply been a test to gauge our military response. Once again, though, the critics of this theory state that debris should have been found if this happened. One other less popular theory is that the craft simply took the jet. Proponents of this theory state that it could explain why the beeps continued in the same place for several moments. Perhaps the craft froze the jet, lifted it into the ship, and then disappeared. The weakness of this theory, though, is that the Air Force would be able to see the altitude of the jet. Still, proponents have suggested that once the plane was frozen, it was disabled from radar detection. While the UFO theory seemed to be the most popular, some suggest this was nothing more than a crash between a Canadian aircraft and a US fighter jet. Since the two nations are friendly, it might have been better for them to sweep it under the rug. Others have suggested it was a commercial aircraft from the United States, but the motivation was the same: not admit embarrassment to the general public. However, this raises the question, wouldn't family members and friends be looking for individuals on that flight? One final theory is that one of the UFO theories holds true and that the government simply chose to cover it up. Perhaps that night, military recovered the craft and jet wreckage. While the plane has never officially been found, there have been some who believe they located it. In the summer of 2005, the Great Lakes Dive Company went out on Lake Superior to test new equipment on two wrecks from 1919. With some extra time, they decided to look for the missing fighter pilot jet. Using advanced sonar technology, the group was able to capture several photos indicating the jet could be below. In addition, nearby, there was something else in the water, according to the group. However, none of what they found appears to be conclusive, and there's not much on this organization. Many have even gone so far to say they never existed, and this all was just an internet rumor. While there doesn't appear to be hard evidence or a conclusion yet, hopefully, in time, we will discover this strange aviation mystery. In the fall of 1977, a British family would have a bizarre and terrifying close encounter of the fourth kind. This case features many elements we see in other types of alien abductions, except it features some type of terrifying entity that the family witnessed. In addition to this, several of the family members' memories of the event seem to have returned bit by bit over the years, eventually leading to a pretty complete picture of what happened that night. In this episode, we will examine this credible alien abduction, an incident that has come to be known as the 1977 Walker family abduction. Sometime in September 1977, the Walker family left a relative's home in Yeovil, England, and began heading home to their house in Chard. It was around 9:30 p.m., and Mr. Walker was driving, with Kate riding shotgun and their two sons, Jeff and Tony, in the back seat. After a few minutes on the road, the family began approaching a remote area known as Wind Whistle Hill. The family began driving up the hill, and then suddenly Kate would see the object and shriek. It was a bright orange cigar-shaped UFO surrounded by some type of mist or cloud. The rest of the family would quickly spot it too. The initial reaction was more of confusion. Mr. Walker pointed out there was a power station right under it, and maybe it had to do with that. But him and Kate quickly reasoned that didn't make sense. The car kept approaching the object, which was around 1,000 feet in the air, and according to Kate's estimates, 200 to 300 feet in length. Kate then glanced over at a nearby hotel, and oddly, all the lights were out. This was very strange, and seemingly the craft had somehow killed the power in the building. At this time, the family was now underneath the object. Kate looked at her watch and was stunned to see that the time all of a sudden was 10:10. Kate, terrified, screamed at her husband to gun it, and the family sped away. Soon the Walkers arrived home, and as Kate entered the home, she would happen to glance over at the clock. It was now 10:50 p.m. To recap, the family left at around 9:30 to drive home. Normally this drive takes about 15 minutes, but on this occasion, it took at least an hour and 15 minutes. The family seemed to remember bits and pieces of what happened that night, but for the most part, the memories were hazy. Several days later, they would once again visit their family, following the same route. Once again, a strange incident would happen on their return trip home. As they began approaching the hill once more, from a distance, the family would spot a person lying down on the road and someone standing over them. As they got closer and closer, they would soon realize that the person couldn't be human. The humanoid had extremely long and thin legs and arms and moved strangely. As such, in a matter of moments, Kate's husband went from a slow approach with the family, ready to help, to putting the pedal to the metal and speeding away. As Kate and her husband returned home, they discussed what they saw and agreed, whatever it was definitely no man. For decades, the family would seemingly have no abnormal experiences. Kate and her husband would divorce, and she would remarry. Then in the mid-1990s, Kate's sons would visit her, and the three talked about what happened on that bizarre night. Jeff, the older brother, would seem to provide the most valuable information in terms of filling in the gaps. More specifically, he recalled his mom yelling at his dad to speed away. However, that didn't happen. The car stalled, and the engine died out completely. Jeff's dad kept trying to start the car, but to no avail. What happened next was incredibly bizarre. Jeff recalled time seemed to slow, and voices sounded like they were in slow motion. Even stranger, Jeff recalled his mom wasn't in the car at this point. He looked to the left and saw his brother Tony, who was staring at the window. As he looked back at his dad, he was pointing behind Jeff and looked completely terrified. Tony would begin to signal something was out there too. A bright white light shined in the car, and a frightened Jeff slid down in an attempt to hide. At this point, he glanced to his left, and Tony was now gone. His concept of time was pretty much gone, and he noticed a tall, lanky figure approach the side of the car near the passenger door. He could see the face, which looked somewhat human, but he knew it was not. The humanoid began bending over and looking in the car. It looked at him, and Jeff somehow knew it was his turn to go up. All four of the family would be taken. The next memory for Jeff was driving down the road and spotting a cyclist headlight. Interestingly, this was Kate's next memory after yelling at her husband to step on it. Jeff, like Kate, recalled seeing the craft, and the next memory was driving down the road and seeing the biker. Kate would soon meet with researchers and tell the story. She recalled specifically how even after such a bizarre sighting and encounter, the family just went on with their lives. This is evidenced by the family taking the same route just several days later. Without question, somehow the family's memories of the event were suppressed. This is not uncommon, but in this case it's surely interesting how many of Jeff's came back. Some ufologists suggested hypnosis to Kate, but ultimately she decided against it, perhaps fearing the entire truth. Still, what can we make of this case? The Walker abduction is surely an interesting one, and features many characteristics we see in other incidents, such as missing time, the bright white light, and the cigar-shaped UFO. In addition, they have memories of what happened on the craft, but memories of the UFO and the encounter were somewhat hazy. This is something we see all too often, something individuals do hypnotic therapy for to remember the events. One other thing that lends support to the Walker story is that the late 70s was a time of many alien abduction reports. Even more so, the area they resided in had multiple reports, albeit most of the witnesses wished to remain anonymous. Interestingly, one witness reported their encounter in the exact same place the Walker family had theirs. In sum, the Walker case appears to be pretty credible, with multiple witnesses remembering the event. It doesn't appear the family was taken again, but it's surely possible they have been and are just unaware. When most people think of Brazilian alien encounters, they tend to think of the popular Varginha UFO incident. In that case, which happened on January 13th, 1996, several Brazilians saw a UFO crash, and two young girls spotted a red-eyed alien. Soon after the crash, the Brazilian military showed up and seemingly covered up the event. While the case is certainly a fascinating one, decades earlier, a Brazilian man would have an extremely weird alien encounter. This case features many elements we see from time to time. However, it also features an extremely bizarre robotic being. In this episode, we will examine the alien abduction of Antonio LaRubia. On September 15th, 1977, bus driver Antonio LaRubia woke up around his usual time, 2 a.m., and began to start getting ready for the workday. Antonio lived in Paciencia, which is a neighborhood in the west zone of Rio de Janeiro. That morning, Antonio exited his home and began his walk toward the bus he would take to the terminal of the Oriental Bus Company where he worked. After just a few minutes of walking, Antonio spotted a massive UFO hovering over a field. It was quite low to the ground and shaped like a hat somewhat. The craft was at least 70 meters across, as it covered more than the entire field, and later measurements would confirm the field distance was 70 meters. Upon seeing the UFO, Antonio was shocked. He had never believed in them, but this was clearly something not man-made. His surprise quickly turned to fear, and Antonio began to turn around and sprinting back toward his home. However, as he started to, a bright blue light engulfed the area, and Antonio was frozen. Then, Antonio would see them. There were 3 incredibly bizarre-looking beings standing around him. One was in front of him, while another stood at his side, and one other was behind him. They were between 3 to 4 feet in height. Their heads were shaped like footballs, and in the middle was some type of blue mirror going across. Their torso was quite large and bulky, and was covered by scales similar to a reptile. Antonio would later say he didn't think it was some type of armor, as they were able to move around easily. Perhaps the oddest thing about the creatures, though, was the arms. They seemed to possess tentacles, similar to an octopus. For legs, there was a single leg which their trunks rested, and Antonio would note the beings would float along. In addition, the beings appeared to be a grayish silver color. Then one of the beings would raise an object that looked like a syringe and pointed at him. Antonio was then pulled toward the UFO. He would black out for a few moments and then find himself in a hallway. There, a being would draw blood through some type of syringe-like instrument. After this, he spotted 2 of the beings go one way, and another being head the other direction. Once again, he blacked out, and then woke up in a large circular room. Inside, he would spot many more robotic beings. There were at least a dozen on both sides of him. Oddly, Antonio would allege to hear the beings breathing, which is certainly peculiar, considering they appear to be robotic. Up to this point, Antonio had been unable to scream, but then he was able to all of a sudden shout. He yelled, "Who are you? What do you want?" Weird and unexpectedly, all the creatures fell down. A blue light then once again hit him, and once again he was unable to speak. A terrified Antonio now was having problems breathing. Next, the beings would show Antonio a series of pictures and videos on a screen. The first was him seemingly being tested on a metallic silver table. He was naked and being hit with a blue light. Some speculate that this was a prior abduction and that they were showing this to him once again. The beings would show several more videos of Antonio, including one with an orange orb next to him. Another fascinating video was one in which the being showed him them manufacturing their UFOs. According to Antonio, he saw a video of thousands of UFOs being built in a huge factory. There were perhaps thousands of the beings floating around and working on them. After this, Antonio stated the beings threw him outside the craft and onto the street. It was now 2:20 a.m., and the whole ordeal lasted about 15 minutes. Antonio was not in the field he was taken, but was close to his work. After hitting the ground, he would look up and see the bottom of the craft, which then flew away. Antonio was able to get to a later bus into work and even managed to finish his shift that day. However, in the ensuing days, he would get violently ill. He went to work the next day, but was so hot he asked a coworker to hose him down. his temperature would continue to rise to around 104, and he would have to visit the hospital. He would soon have to resign from his job due to his health. At the hospital, he would tell everyone about his abduction experience, and this led to a psychological evaluation, which he was deemed normal. In time, word of his encounter would reach ufologists and journalists. In particular, a journalist named Irene Granchi would document the story and translate it too. In time, the report would appear in the APRO Bulletin and the Canadian UFO Report Journal. Still, what can we make of this extremely weird case? Was this just one man's attempt at fame and fortune? Or should we take his claims seriously? This case doesn't appear to be highly credible, yet it doesn't mean we should dismiss Antonio's claim completely. For one, excluding Antonio, there was only one other witness who saw the UFO. Unfortunately for him, it was the town drunk who was known for creating stories, and surely wasn't a reliable witness. In addition to this, his description of the beings seems like something straight out of a low-budget science fiction movie. Moreover, his experience was pretty bizarre, and many of the memories seem to be somewhat fragmented. It should be pointed out, he didn't recall this experience from hypnotic regression, and these are conscious memories. That said, what factors does Antonio have working in his favor? There are several things that appeared in his case, which we have seen in other cases. The first are the screens and videos he was shown. This is actually not too rare, and it's thought this is done to gauge the reaction of the subject. For example, we did see this in the Amari Rivera alien abduction from Puerto Rico, a case we covered on this channel. In that incident, Amari would allege to see videos of worldwide destruction on planet Earth. Also, another incident we covered is the Avery, England abduction. In that case, two abductees named John and Elaine would lie down on a table and the beings would tell them to look up at a screen. On the screen, a series of images began to display. They popped up rapidly, and the beings began communicating inside both Elaine and John's head. What the beings were doing in Antonio's case is anyone's guess. Some think they were testing or gauging his reaction. Others think this might have been a show of force, as they showed they got to him before, and they can get to him at any time. The second intriguing thing in this case is the syringe-like device which they use to freeze him and steer him toward the craft. We have seen this before on the Street of Silence, and it is without a doubt a unique detail. First, in the 1951 Salzburg, Austria alien abduction, in that case a soldier encountered a strange being in the woods and was paralyzed by a pencil-like device. A second case we covered on this channel is the 1951 Maurice Massey abduction that happened in France. In that case, Maurice, who was a French farmer, spotted a UFO and some beings. He began to flee, but as he got about 15 feet away, suddenly one of the beings would point a pencil-like device that paralyzed him. Strangely, Maurice was still standing up as he was paralyzed. He could still feel his heartbeat and blink, but couldn't move any major muscles. He was then taken inside the craft. Much of what happened to Antonio is somewhat typical of what we see in these cases as well. He was taken, tested somehow, and returned. He suffered adverse health effects for about a month, and while the beings probably didn't care much about his personal health and well-being, it doesn't seem like they were trying to harm him. Some question Antonio's story because he did tell everyone about it. Was he trying to get fame or fortune? Perhaps, but it's important to note he did go to the hospital and was without question violently ill. It's not known if Antonio had additional close encounters or if he was able to move on with his life. In 1984, a Guatemalan woman named Juanita accepted a job as a caretaker in Los Angeles, California. Juanita was on a work visa and was thrilled with the position as she would be taking care of an elderly person named Dominica Moffit. Dominica had suffered a stroke and needed round-the-clock care. Initially, Domenica's health appeared to be doing okay, but after a short time it quickly deteriorated. While the Moffit family was very upset, Juanita was desperate, as if Domenica were to pass, she would be deported. As such, she turned to an ancient practice, Santeria, in an attempt to save Domenica. However, the ritual failed, and Juanita would unleash something, a terrifying evil that would haunt the Moffit family for years to come. In this episode, we will examine this terrifying and fascinating case, one that touched on many interesting topics such as blood sacrifice, poltergeist activity, possession, reincarnation, demonology, and one Prince of Hell. This story is now known as the Moffit family haunting. In 1984, a young woman named Deborah married Bill Moffit Jr., and the two settled into Bill's home on Archibald Avenue in Los Angeles. Not only did Bill live on the street, but several family members did as well. On one side were Bill's parents, named Bill Sr. and Lee, and on the other side was Bill's aunt, Domenica. Sometime in 1984, Domenica suffered a stroke, and while the family hoped and thought she would recover and be self-sufficient, it soon became obvious this was not going to be the case. As such, they hired a woman named Juanita, and it was truly a match made in heaven, at least for a short time. Juanita needed to extend her work visa and got along great with the family, and she was also excellent at what she did. However, soon, Domenica's health failed. A frightened Juanita, fearing deportation, decided to turn to an ancient practice she knew from her homeland, one known as Santeria. Santeria is a religion in which individuals often call upon ancient gods and request favors. Many times rituals involved in this religion involve sacrifice in exchange for a request. It's not exactly clear what ritual Juanita performed, but based on the Moffit story, she clearly called something. Around several weeks after Juanita had started practicing Santeria, Domenica's health failed, and she stopped responding to her medicine. She then perished. The following day, Bill and his dad went over to Domenica's house and would find a distraught and terrified Juanita. She was hysterical and apologized profusely, stating, "I was only trying to help. I was only trying to help." Juanita told Bill and his dad that something was trying to get her, something that was pure evil. She knew she had done something terribly wrong, and once again apologized, stating she was only trying to help. Bill would arrange for Juanita to be picked up, and before she left, she warned Bill and his dad to stay out of Domenica's house, as evil lurked there. They didn't think much of it at the time, but in the years to come, this message they would think about over and over. A few weeks would pass, and the Moffit family would decide to start packing up Domenica's home. While most rooms looked pretty normal, in several rooms there was evidence that some sort of strange ritual had been performed. On the walls there were strange symbols, burnt candles, and even worse, feathers and blood spots around. Most who have studied the case agree that Juanita had performed some type of sacrifice in an attempt to save Domenica's life. The next few years the family would move on with their lives, and no paranormal activity would happen. In order to save money, Bill and his wife moved in next door to his parents' home and decided to rent out their house. Then, a young man named Danny moved in. It should be pointed out Bill was an avid sports memorabilia collector and had an entire room in his home dedicated to it. As such, when Danny moved in, he had to agree to stay out of this room. Danny had no issue with this, and for a long time things were good. Then, one day Bill went over to see his collection and would notice that several bobbleheads had been moved down to the floor. Strangely though, they were put in the shape of a triangle. Bill initially thought Danny had moved the bobbleheads and was playing some sort of joke on him. Normally Danny kept the door locked, and he thought he might have just forgot to lock it, and Bill might have done this as a joke. The two had a great relationship, and Bill wasn't upset about it. However, when he asked Danny about the bobbleheads, Danny just shrugged and swore he didn't do it. This would appear to be the start of the paranormal activity for the Moffit family. Very shortly after this incident, paranormal activity would begin in Bill's parents' home. One day his mom, Lee, discovered a statue of Jesus on an altar she always prayed to, had underwear on it. Lee would appear to become the focal point of the haunting in the years to come. The strange activity would continue for Lee. The next day she found jewelry on the altar. Then she found a wallet, which later they found belonged to Danny. Several more items that were Danny's appeared on the altar on successive days. The couple was very embarrassed and didn't know how to explain this to Danny. As such, they decided to head over to his home when he was out and place the items in there. Then, shockingly, a few days later, the items reappeared on the altar once more. Several weeks after this, an exhausted-looking Danny knocked on the Moffit family home and told them he would be gone in 24 hours. None of this made any sense. Danny was happy in the home, and to leave so suddenly was very out of character. A day later, though, he was gone for good. Was Danny haunted out of the home? After Danny left, Bill entered the home, and he would be shocked to see Danny had left many things behind. Even more bizarre, Danny, or something, had drawn strange symbols on several of the light switches in crayon. It's not evident if these were the same symbols Bill had witnessed several years prior in Domenica's home. A few days later, Deborah Moffit was cleaning the home when she would spot several decorative dogs. They were pointed in her direction. She would turn around, and as she turned back, the dogs were now reversed. Bill didn't initially believe her and thought she probably had imagined it. To test his theory, he left the home and noted where several objects were and went to sleep. The next morning he walked over to the home, and a lamp that was in the corner had been put directly on the center of the floor. The two now strongly suspected something paranormal was happening. Deborah decided to yell out at the spirit, asking it to show itself. However, things didn't go as planned. A few minutes later, the kitchen table was dragged across the floor by something to the center of the room. At this point, the Moffit family knew something paranormal was happening. Of the 4 members of the household, 3 had experienced unexplained phenomena. The only person, Bill's dad, hadn't, and he was somewhat skeptical. The next few weeks, activity would cease, and the Moffit family decided once again to rent the home. Eventually, Bill was able to rent the home to a young couple named Tom and Michelle. The first few weeks were very quiet, and life appeared to be getting back to normal. Then one day, Deborah spotted Michelle sitting on the steps of the home, clearly upset. Michelle had a bruise on her face and explained that Tom had hit her. Michelle went on to explain that he had become extremely violent and angry since moving in the home, something she had never seen before. Several days later, Michelle was nowhere to be found. Deborah would ask Tom about where she was, and Tom said they got into a terrible fight and she moved out. A few weeks after this, Tom would inform the Moffits that he would be leaving the home. While there was no mention of paranormal activity, what happened next would truly be shocking. Once more, Bill and Deborah headed over to the property to clean up and prepare it for the next tenant. Oddly though, the property was extremely clean, and the only peculiar thing was there was a rug missing. Just several days later, an odd man would show up at the Moffit home asking to speak with Tom. The Moffits would inform him that Tom had moved out. The man stated he had some terrible news to give him. Michelle was found dead. She had been found beaten to death and rolled into a rug. The family debated what to do, but ultimately questionably decided not to call the police. It doesn't appear Michelle's death got much attention either, as it wasn't in the papers. Still, the incident was quite unsettling, and it appears that Tom had probably murdered Michelle. According to the man, Michelle's body was covered with bruises. The event raises questions as to what happened. Did the evil spirit command Tom to do these things, or did he become possessed? Clearly something evil happened, and before Tom moved in, he was described as a carefree man. In a matter of weeks, he became an angry wife-beater. With lots of unsettling activity happening on the street, the Moffit family decided to sell their homes and buy one larger home. As they put their home up for sale, unexpectedly the paranormal activity intensified. Things became extremely strange, with objects vanishing and moving around multiple times a day. On moving day, things got incredibly bad. The mysterious entity ripped off a kitchen cabinet from the wall and threw it into the middle of the kitchen floor. Also, multiple windows exploded all by themselves. The family was just trying to get out as quickly as possible and leave their home on Archibald Avenue. However, the strange activity wouldn't stop, and this story is just getting started. The family moved to Rancho Cucamonga in California, and for several months, things were quiet. Life seemingly had returned to normal. Then, like so many of these cases we follow, the activity began once again. It started small, with objects disappearing and strange noises. Soon it intensified. The house alarm started going off each night, although no one had broke in. Soon they started hearing voices up in the attic. Eventually, and terrifyingly, when family members were alone, a voice would whisper their name. Then the evil entity began to communicate with the family. Lee came into the bathroom one morning and saw a message written in soap on the mirror. It read, "Talk to me." She grabbed a shocked Deborah, who cleaned the mirror, and after several minutes it came and stated, "No escape." The messages would continue, often being threatening. One message stated, "I hate Lee." Bill's dad became angry and asked the entity who it was, to which it replied, "The prince." Something we will dive into more in the video. One message stated, "Lee die." After much debate, the family brought in a priest to bless the home. However, this only angered the spirit. In the time that followed, paranormal activity would get worse, and the entity would begin to try and harm the family. For example, they would find knives and sharp objects in seats and in their bed. In addition to this, they would find strange triangle symbols throughout the home. The activity got so bad that Bill's parents were so scared they decided to move downstairs and sleep near Bill and Deborah. It appears most of the activity was directed at Lee. For the next few months, with so much going on, the Moffit family decided to start researching the paranormal. They would begin hiring more paranormal researchers and others who investigated their home. One researcher would tell them they were dealing with a powerful, ancient entity. To try and calm it, the family tried to communicate with it through the mirrors, but this failed. One group the family hired was some shamans. They came and attempted to remove the evil entity from the home. The shamans performed a cleansing in the attic. In a terrifying moment, while this was occurring, Deborah would see the being manifest in the insulation. Deborah would be the family member who would write the book on these events. While things were already scary, things were about to get worse. Investigator Gary Kent came to the home to study the evil spirit. The entity immediately began targeting him. The entity would routinely throw things at Gary, and on occasion would cut his hair. The family would see his hair falling to the floor, although no one was around. Soon, renowned paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived to help. Ed was a demonologist, so the Moffits believed having his background would surely help. However, Lorraine would be the one to pinpoint what was haunting them. It was an ancient demon. While the Warrens were there, the demons would possess Bill's dad, and Bill Sr. would threaten to bite off Ed's hand. Bill's dad would also speak in a completely different voice and language, typical hallmark traits of possession. After some time, the Warrens were unable to help the Moffit family and would leave. In some time, Deborah would have a baby. With events turning more violent, she begged the entity not to hurt the baby. The entity responded it wouldn't and only wanted to hurt Lee. It surely kept its word, as Lee was attacked again and again. One time she was strangled by invisible hands and had red marks on her throat for days. Then the family would learn something fascinating about who the spirit was. Deborah communicated with it, and it claimed that in the 1600s, a few French monks practiced Satanism. One thing the nuns promised to Satan was that they would sacrifice a nun. However, they never followed through with this. The demon alleged that Lee was one of these nuns in a past life. This seemed to reveal the reason why the entity hated Lee so much. During this communication, the demon would also state that Lee would die in 10 days. 10 days later, Lee became violently ill with pneumonia and was taken to the emergency room. There, Lee would almost die and alleged to see a black shadow that appeared as a humanoid in the room. Was this evil entity there to collect her if she passed? After Lee was released from the hospital, this black shadow would follow her home as well. The evil entity would continue to torture her, cutting the tubes on her oxygen tank on several occasions. Soon the Moffit family called in parapsychologist Dr. Evelyn Paglini to investigate. Paglini would quickly realize that it was a very strong demon and told the family they might be underestimating just how powerful it was. According to him, the entity was one of the 7 princes of hell. It's important to point out too, when Bill Sr. communicated with the being and asked who it was, it referred to itself as Prince. In 1990, Gary Kent would come again to the home. The demon hated Gary and turned its focus to him once again. The demon would communicate to the family that it would take Gary's life instead of Lee's. At this time, Bill's dad would start acting extremely strange, often having conversations with no one and spending much time alone. The family then decided it was time to try an exorcism once again. During the ritual, Bill's dad became extremely violent, running and trying to attack the priests. The family soon realized Bill's dad had been communicating with the Prince of Hell and speculated the evil entity was trying to get him to kill his wife. As such, Bill's dad checked into a mental hospital. However, things did not go as expected. The staff at the hospital believed that Lee was masterminding the events and manipulating Bill's dad. This caused Lee and Bill's dad to soon divorce, with him moving away. After this, paranormal activity definitely decreased significantly. In 1992, with some activity still happening, Gary returned for a third time. Paranormal activity intensified, and Gary tried to get the demon to come with him and leave the home. It refused, but finally things would come to an end. One day, a message appeared on a mirror stating, "Goodbye, my family." After this, the family never had any more paranormal experiences. It should be noted, when Gary returned home for several months, the strange triangle symbol showed up in his house. However, activity would cease pretty quickly. What can we make of this terrifying and well-documented story? First off, this case appears to have many interesting aspects, such as Santeria and sacrifice, poltergeist activity, demonology, possession, reincarnation, and possibly shadow people. The leading theory on this case is that Juanita accidentally opened a door practicing Santeria and released a violent and powerful demon. This demon targeted Lee and any who were in its way of its goal, which was to collect her soul. Some speculate that its targeting of Lee is evidence of a soul and reincarnation. The soul of Lee made that pact with the devil in the 1600s, and even though Lee had never dealt with the occult, her soul did in a past life. A poltergeist is another theory, as they haunt a person, not a place. It should be pointed out many believe poltergeists are just demons. The case has some incredible similarities to other poltergeist stories, many of which we have covered on this channel. The strange activity starts small and is often just pranks and harmless. Soon though, it escalates, and sometimes these entities become dangerous. Some argue this theory and state poltergeists usually don't manifest, which this entity did in the hospital. Is this case credible, though? In our opinion, this appears to be a highly credible case. There were multiple witnesses, including a variety of witnesses who were familiar with these types of entities. In addition, the being communicated on multiple occasions and was experienced by all family members, as well as Juanita and multiple investigators. The story lasted for years, and while some of the stories might be exaggerated or created, it's tough to believe all of the investigators, priests, and others would have helped create this story. In sum, this story is surely an interesting one, and a case that continues to be studied today. On the morning of August 12th, 1983, one of the most famous alien encounters in the town of Aldershot, England would occur. This older case continues to be extremely controversial among ufologists and locals to the area. That said, this close encounter of the third kind is quite interesting and one that deserves examination. In this episode, we will explore the Alfred Burtoo alien encounter. Sometime after midnight, on August 12, 1983, 77-year-old Alfred Burtoo grabbed his fishing gear and with his dog Tiny began heading down to the desolate Basingstoke Canal for some night fishing. After checking out a few spots, Alfred finally picked his fishing spot around 1 a.m. Then around 15 minutes later, Alfred would spot a bright light heading toward him. It settled down around 300 feet away, right next to the path next to the canal. After seeing the light, Alfred didn't think too much of it, as there was a military base just nearby. He poured himself a cup of tea and kept fishing, but soon things would get strange. First, Tiny began barking furiously in the direction of the light. Alfred, with eyes on the water, commanded his dog to stop, but Tiny wouldn't. Alfred then glanced over and saw two dark humanoid figures coming in his direction. He couldn't make out specifics on the beings at first, but Alfred wasn't too worried. This is because Alfred had a military background, and he initially believed the figures might just be coming to check on him. As Alfred smoked his cigarette, he began to make out more details on the figures. They kept approaching, and although he wasn't scared, he surely was becoming curious. The beings got closer and closer. Then, he would spot more details. They were around 4.5 feet tall, wearing green coveralls that covered their whole body. He would later recall there were no buttons or zippers, and it was as if the suit was molded to their bodies. Alfred couldn't see their faces, as the beings wore a green helmet with a black visor. The entities would get around 5 feet away and stop. Both stared at Alfred for several moments, while Tiny continued barking. Then they gestured to him to come along. Alfred would begin following them toward the light. One being walked in front, while another one walked behind him. At this time, Alfred was more curious than scared. He would later recall that some of this had to do with his military training, and some of it had to do with his age and failing health. As he approached the ship, which rested in the air, Alfred would climb the stairs along with the beings. As he entered the room, he had to duck down slightly as to not hit his head. The room was all black and had 8 sides and was warmer than the outside. It had a foul smell, which Alfred compared to rotting meat. As he looked around, he would spot no bolts or screws in the walls, and it appeared to be smooth all over. During this time, Alfred could see the beings out of the corner of his eye. Then he heard some sort of noise, and the beings disappeared behind the wall. It's not clear if they just went through it, or a silent door just slid open, but now Alfred was standing in the room, all by himself. After a few minutes, in the middle of the room, a large shaft rose up from the bottom. Right next to it were 2 more beings, almost identical in appearance to the first 2. The shaft was large, around 4 feet in circumference. Then Alfred would be instructed to come over and stand under the light. He couldn't see any light, though, in the room. He stepped over to the right, and an amber light was right on him. It was glowing from ceiling to floor. He stepped into the light with no hesitation. While the light was shining on him, one of the beings would ask his age. Alfred responded that he would be 78 at his next birthday. He was instructed to turn around, and once he did, the being said, "You can go. You are too old and infirm for our purposes." Somewhat surprised, he left the craft and went back to his fishing spot. There he would grab a sip of tea and notice about an hour had passed. Alfred alleged to be unfazed by the experience and got back to fishing. As he was doing this, he would hear a noise from the craft and also see a bright white light. The craft then shot off into the night sky. Shockingly, Alfred would continue to fish all night, and then around 10 a.m. several policemen would walk by. He would mention the craft in his experience, and astonishingly, one of the policemen didn't seem surprised and even mentioned it was probably here to check out the military base. As the weeks progressed, Alfred found himself thinking more and more about that night in his experience. He wasn't sure of many things, but he did want answers. In October of that year, he decided to reach out to the local newspaper, the Aldershot News, in hope that someone else had seen the craft that night, or perhaps had had a similar experience. Alfred wouldn't find any other witnesses, but the event would draw the attention of several ufologists, such as Timothy Good, who would investigate the case. Good believed Alfred and thought he was telling the truth, although he wished that he would have tried to ask more questions to the beings. What can we make of this incredible story by Alfred Burtoo? Like many cases, there appears to be some things that make it seem genuine, while other aspects that make it seem fabricated. Many skeptics have questioned the story at hand. Some asked how Burtoo was able to remain so calm through the event. Also, what about his dog? It seemed to stay behind at the fishing spot, but some think the dog would have insisted on coming along. In addition to this, it's never good from a credibility perspective to wait months to report a story like this. This is somewhat of an unfair criticism, as it's understandable how people just want to move on with their lives. Still, Alfred was 77 and didn't seem to be scared of much. Several things in the story also align with other UFO reports. For one, the beings were near a military base. It's well documented, even in present day, that UFOs seem to get spotted near military installations. There's various theories on this, which include scary ones, like they are gathering intelligence data and assessing our defenses, and other ones suggesting they are just curious about our capabilities. One interesting case that has incredible similarities is the 1971 Finland forestry alien encounter, which we covered on this channel not too long ago. In that case, the being is described almost exactly the same way. The being in that case had green coveralls with a green helmet and a black visor. The only difference between these two cases, in terms of the beings, is that in the Finland case, the beings were described as 2 feet tall, while Alfred said they were around 4 feet. The Finland case happened 7 years before Alfred's encounter. Alfred alleged in the encounter the beings didn't want him because of his declining health. This is something we've seen in other cases as well, and not too surprising. Alfred had mixed emotions on this decision by the beings, though, as a part of him wanted to travel through the universe and get to do things few have done. With his declining health, Alfred would die several years after the encounter. There's rumors that a strong military presence now controls the area where the event occurred. It's reported to be tough to get into and out of, and some speculate the military has recovered crafts or possibly been in contact with the beings. Of course, none of this is known for sure. While we might never get the answers we want in the Alfred Burtoo incident, it surely is an interesting case to examine. On October 17, 1973, Jeff Greenhaw, the police chief of Falkville, Alabama, received a strange call from a resident. The frantic person reported a UFO craft had descended on a nearby field. Off duty at the time, Chief Greenhaw grabbed his revolver along with a Polaroid camera and headed over to see what was happening. When he arrived, there was no UFO. However, something else was there. Something that changed Captain Greenhaw's life forever. In this episode, we will examine this classic 1973 alien encounter, a case that became to be known as the Alabama Metal Man. Around 10 p.m. on October 17th, 1973, Police Chief Jeff Greenhaw was relaxing at home, hoping to have a relaxing evening. Then the phone rang, and his life would change forever. Reports vary as to whether this caller was anonymous or Greenhaw knew the individual, but on the other end of the phone, someone was frantically telling him a UFO had landed in a nearby field. Chief Greenhaw grabbed his gun, keys, and Polaroid and sped toward the field. On the way there, he radioed the event to the station, but when he arrived, there was no UFO at the scene. He turned off his car and began canvassing the area. While no UFO was spotted, Chief Greenhaw did see something else, something that was truly bizarre. As he was walking around, he saw something just on the side of the road and shouted at it. He approached it to get a better look and could see that this was something like he had never seen before. The being was around 6 feet tall and appeared to be covered from head to foot in tinfoil. It began approaching the police vehicle. All its movements were extremely jerky and mechanical. The chief would snap 4 Polaroid pictures of the being. As it got closer, Chief Greenhaw turned on the headlights to the car. This seemed to scare it, and the entity took off running. The being was fast, extremely fast. Chief Greenhaw hopped in his vehicle and chased it through the field, but since the field was uneven terrain, he could only get up to 35 miles per hour. Notably though, the being was getting farther and farther away from him. The chief's car eventually fell into a ditch, and the being got away. Greenhaw would later recall the being was running faster than any human he had ever seen run. Like many alien encounters and UFO sightings, the event would take a life of its own after it happened. Greenhaw would tell his story, and it would wreck his life. The town mocked him and lost all respect for the young captain. Several weeks after reporting the incident, the town council would fire Captain Greenhaw. Soon, his wife would leave him, and to add insult to injury, Greenhaw's house burned down sometime after the report. Greenhaw would go into a deep depression and isolate from others. He recalled that he couldn't trust anyone, and many of his friends stabbed him in the back. While Greenhaw's case is surely a fascinating and a strange one, it is quite controversial. Author Charlton Hall would write a book claiming when he was a teenager, him and his friends faked several alien encounters in the Alabama area. Among these, Hall alleges he and his friends were responsible for the 1973 Alabama Metal Man. While Hall alleges to have faked the incidents, there are still questions surrounding the event. The most notable question surrounds the speed at which the being moved away. If it's true that the being ran at the speeds even close to what Chief Greenhaw alleges, then there's no way that these teenagers could have faked this. Still, much of the event could have been faked. The phone call could have been a prank. A teenager could have wrapped himself in tinfoil and created the alien costume. The mechanical movements as well could have been fabricated. Probably the key piece of evidence in this case are the photos. The photos were examined and have never been proved to be a hoax. Around 10 years after the event, the originals and negatives were stolen, but luckily copies were still around. Like many UFO sightings and alien encounters, the details in this photo are tough to make out, and it's really inconclusive. As a result, this case really comes down to eyewitness testimony. One of the big hurdles for Jeff Greenhaw has to do with the fact that he was the sole witness. While many believe Greenhaw in its story, it's tough to substantiate stories like this with just one eyewitness. To make matters worse, this case occurred in the early 1970s, a time when reporting a UFO or an alien encounter was definitely met with ridicule. This has led many to speculate there are many other undocumented cases out there. It's important to note too, there have been other cases of robotic-like aliens, so these are not really that rare. One case we covered on this channel earlier was one involving the Cisco Grove encounter. The case of the Alabama Metal Man has inspired much, appearing in television and books and being a popular Southern alien encounter. One final point concerning this case is that Jeff Greenhaw never wavered around what he saw. He regretted reporting it since it caused him so much pain, but he has remained adamant about the events of that night. On Sunday, October 28, 1973, a young truck driver would show up in a hospital in Bahia Blanca, Argentina, in a complete state of amnesia. The man did not know his name, where he lived, any family, and had no personal, identifiable information on him. The confused hospital staff examined the man to see if he had any head injuries, but other than a bad headache, there was nothing evident. The man was found wandering aimlessly around asking for help, and soon a good Samaritan would take him to the hospital. In several days, the man's memory would come back, and soon he would realize he had an encounter with something strange that night. In this episode, we will explore the alien encounter of Dionisa, Llanca. On the evening of Saturday, October 27th, 1973, around 6 p.m., Argentinian truck driver Dionisa Llanca woke up from sleeping and began getting ready. Llanca lived in a small cottage by himself in Calle Chubat, which was around 10 minutes from Bahia Blanca. Since he would be driving all night, he ate dinner around 10 p.m. and then around 12:30 p.m. headed out the door to drive toward Rio Gallegos, which was around a 2-day trip. Llanca was used to driving all night, and on this trip, he would be hauling construction materials. Right before leaving, Llanca would see his right rear tire was low on air. He considered changing it, but thought it could make the trip. This decision would change his life forever. Shortly into his drive, Llanca would notice the tire was much worse than he thought. He had no choice but to pull over and change the tire. At 1:15 a.m., on the dark, deserted road, Llanca began pulling down his tools and began to change the tire. It was cold and extremely dark, and Llanca was upset he didn't stop and change it at one of the gas stations he had passed. Then behind the truck, a bright yellow light would suddenly light up the entire road. Llanca was busy trying to fix the tire, so he didn't realize the extent of the light at first. He thought it was just another truck with its high beams on. However, the brightness intensified, and Llanca soon realized this was something else. The light then changed to blue. Llanca tried to get up, but couldn't. His legs were paralyzed. He was on his knees, but was able to turn his head. As he did, he would spot a strange oval-shaped craft hovering. Even more shocking, though, to the right of his shoulder behind him, 3 humanoid beings stood. The beings were around 5 feet tall, with blonde hair, and had tight-fitted silver coveralls. They sported yellow boots and had long black gloves. They had no belts or helmets. There were 2 men and 1 woman. The beings looked human, except their eyes. They were more slanted than ours. Llanca would also note they had large foreheads as well. The beings would stand and talk among themselves in a strange language. It sounded like a strange chirping sound. Still paralyzed at the time, Llanca was unable to get up. Things would get even worse for him, though. He soon realized he was unable to speak or move his face. Then nothing could prepare Llanca for what happened next. One of the beings grabbed him by his collar and easily lifted him into the air. Llanca tried to talk and communicate, but still wasn't able to. As he was suspended in the air, one of the other beings stepped over, and it stuck some sort of device into his finger. Llanca would state this didn't hurt, but it did produce a little bit of blood. After this, he would pass out, and this is where the mystery begins. Sometime between 2 to 3 a.m. on the same night, Llanca would wake up in a rail yard. This spot was around 6 kilometers from where Llanca's truck had broken down, and his truck was still there. Llanca began walking toward the lights and would soon come upon a road. He would appear to wander for some time and eventually end up in the city. The man who dropped him off stated Llanca was mumbling and described him as being catatonic or like a robot. That morning, Dr. Ricardo Smirnoff, a forensic surgeon, would examine Llanca and recalled the strange incident. Smirnoff would state, "I am a forensic surgeon. I had rotating duty on Sunday the 28th. About 9:30, Dr. Alpotero at the Spanish hospital called me and said that he had a curious case. I arrived at the hospital around 10:15 and saw a young man of about 25 or 26 years of age in a total state of amnesia. He could remember nothing of his past. He did not know who he was, where he was born, who his parents were, or anything about his past. He cried continually and asked what town he was in. The doctor told me that a man had left him at the hospital after encountering him wandering in the center of the city like a robot and asking everyone he met where a police box was. At first he thought he had an automobile accident on the road. He changed this as he had no injuries. When I touched his head or came near his hand, he drew back instinctively as though it would produce pain. He had a bad headache in the right parietal temporal area. I notified the police and had him admitted to the municipal hospital. In the days that followed, Llanca's memory would come back, or most of his memories. He was able to recall the encounter with the beings and regained his memories around his personal life. Still, it's not known what happened after he blacked out and got to the rail yard. The distance was over 6 kilometers, so this raises the question, did he walk there, or was he put there by the beings? Mathematically, it's possible he walked there, even in his catatonic state, as a person could do this walk in 1 hour and 15 minutes, or possibly even quicker. If you recall, he encountered the beings at 1:15 a.m. and was in the rail yard sometime between 2 to 3. That said, we should point out, being in a catatonic and paranoid state like he was, this probably would have slowed his walking speed. That said, it's surely possible that he did walk the walk by himself, and there was no abduction, but it's not known. As for the encounter, this case appears to have many credible aspects. First, the beings approached the man on the highway, and it involved a bright bluish light. This is a scene we see all too often, and crafts approaching people on desolate roads we see time and time again. Also, the beings appear to be Nordic aliens. All three are reported as having blonde hair and large foreheads, as well as tight-fitted silver suits. Those are characteristics many report when seeing these beings. One interesting aspect of this case is the chirping sound. Not too long ago, on a case we covered on this channel, the 1967 Riri, Idaho alien encounter, 2 young men would report this strange characteristic. While driving on a desolate highway, they would encounter strange beings who communicated through chirping. It's a strange coincidence, although the beings in this case did not appear to be Nordics, as they appeared to have wrinkly skin. That said, perhaps these 2 different species share a common communication manner. It's said that Llanca is a simple man with no interest in UFOs. In the days he was interviewed by ufologists, he was said to be extremely somber and did not smile once. Hospital staff characterized him as traumatized and innocent. Of course, skeptics will argue these symptoms are easy to fake, and he may have done this for the attention. Still, by all accounts, this was the only close encounter of the third kind that Llanca had, and he was able to move on from his experience. One of the stranger types of ETs reported are incidents involving entities nicknamed the Michelin Men. Michelin Men, or ETs, reported to appear as humanoids, being about 3 to 6 feet tall, and are said to be made of stacked, ring-like segments that make them appear inflated. The nickname, of course, comes from the resemblance to the Michelin Man, the mascot for the Michelin Tire Company. In 1977, at least 3 individuals would spot one of these strange alien creatures. In this episode, we will explore this little-known case, an incident now known as the 1977 Tucson alien encounter. In 1977, a young teenager named Louise Stovall was visiting her grandmother's home. That night, Louise was sitting on the couch, watching TV, when she would see a strange light come in from the window. Confused as to what it was, Louise got up and walked over to the window to get a better view. At the window, Louise saw what appeared to look like a bright star or flame rising just to the left of Lillian Cavett Elementary School. Then the craft began hovering down behind the fence that separates her grandmother's home and school. It would continue to descend until it came within a few inches of the ground. At this point, Louise yelled to her grandmother, named Alice Buckner, to come over and see the craft. The two then moved over to the front door to get a better view. The craft then ascended, went over the school fence and the street, and landed in Alice's yard. At this point, the two went out into the yard to investigate further. The craft was not big, around 6 feet long, and rounded at the end, shaped like a capsule. A bright light came from inside it, and it appeared to have a transparent front with some type of entity inside. At this time, Alice and Louise were more curious than scared, and were around 50 feet away. Then the craft slowly hovered toward them, only around 10 feet or so in the air. Inside the craft, they could see what was inside. There was a humanoid behind some bars. It was gray in color and puffy looking, like a Michelin Man. The two couldn't make out any facial features, nor did they see if it had any hands. It appeared to be bent over forward and holding some type of control, although they weren't sure on this. Alice was very curious, and at this point the craft was just several feet away. Alice walked up and underneath it, tried to touch the bottom, but was a few feet shy. As she reached up, the craft appeared to ascend a bit more as well. In front of the object, Alice would also get a better view of the occupant as well. It was standing on some sort of light or flame and wore a puffy suit. The being was quite small, around 3 to 4 feet, a typical height reported for these entities. Despite the close encounter, the being never moved even in the slightest, leading some to believe it was some type of robot. The craft would continue to float slowly away. First it went over Alice's carport, and then it went over the tree lines. Alice and Louise went out and watched the craft float up into the sky for some time. They were able to do this because the light from the craft was so bright, it was easily distinguishable from the stars. While the story from Alice and Louise is certainly incredible, another individual in the area would spot the craft, providing further support for their story. Miss Desi Turner, who was Alice's next-door neighbor, lived at 2202 East Paquita Vista. Around 7:30 p.m., Desi was brushing her teeth when she saw a strange light coming through her curtains. Initially, she thought it was a car turning around in her driveway, but after a few minutes, she became suspicious and went over to get a better look. She opened the curtains, and Desi was stunned to see a bright cigar-shaped object. She looked over and saw Alice and Louise in the yard, looking at the craft. Desi would estimate the object to be about 6 feet long and 2.5 feet wide. She ran in and called the police and the TV station, but to her surprise, no one came. The craft would soon hover away, and unlike Alice and Louise, Desi did not stick around and watch. With multiple independent witnesses, the case surely seems very credible. All 3 witnesses would report seeing multiple helicopters, presumably military aircraft, flying around the area, something highly unusual. Alice would check with the police station, and they confirmed they did not have any up in the sky that night, which strongly suggests that they were military choppers. Still, what can we make of this case? What probably stands out the most is the being, the so-called Michelin Man. There's a number of cases involving these Michelin men, with most happening between 1950 and 1970. One of the first cases happened in Bolton, England in 1962. Henry Thomas, then a young boy, spotted 3 short, bulky humanoids looking into a window. The beings didn't harm him in any way, and later on he sketched what he saw that day. Another encounter happened in 1960 in Spain. A teacher named Miguel Sabalas spotted 2 of these Michelin men crossing the road. Interestingly, in this case, one was short and one was tall. One of the more famous encounters happened in France on July 31st, 1968. Farmer Luce Fontaine saw a blue and white craft near Plauen des Cafres. Inside the craft, he spotted 2 small Michelin men inside. In this case, the landing site and Fontaine's clothing both contained radioactive traces after the event. In time, this case became a popular one in France. So what are these strange entities? In general, there are 3 main theories. The first is that these are some type of alien species, one that seems relatively harmless. Individuals who encounter these beings often experience phenomena such as heat, paralysis, electrical interference, like car engines and lights failing. Like many other encounters, there are stories of missing time and eerie silence when people see these beings. The second theory is that the Michelin Men are simply suits worn by biological ETs. The thought here is that the beings cannot survive in the Earth's atmosphere and need to wear these for whatever reason. The third theory is that these Michelin Men are actually humans or the military testing out some type of suit. This is one of the less popular theories, but some suggest the Michelin Men are some type of suit that the military tested out for some reason. The final theory is these beings are robotic in nature, but ultimately are being controlled by ETs. This is evidenced by the behavior of the beings in many of the stories. Is Louise and Alice's story credible? The case has a number of aspects supporting it. First, there were 3 witnesses to the event, all of whom reported similar details. Second, Alice and Louise reported a truly unique being, the Michelin Man, one that really only UFO aficionados were aware of at the time. While it could be the case they created the story, it seems more likely than not they didn't. Cases of this strange creature seem to have reduced dramatically over the last few decades. Have these entities explored and gotten all the answers they wanted? It's tough to imagine they have stopped studying or visiting us altogether, but reports of them have certainly dwindled. Have these strange creatures moved on, or will we see them again one day? An overwhelming majority of UFO cases are reported to occur at night, and often desolate areas. It makes sense on many levels. These beings, for whatever reason, choose to remain in the shadows. For decades, this trend has remained pretty consistent. However, every once in a while, we get a case of a UFO being spotted in a heavily populated area. There are various theories as to why, which we will discuss later in the video. In today's episode, we will cover a case where a UFO came into a city, situated itself among several high-rises, and was witnessed by dozens of Germans. In this video, we will cover the 1994 Plauen, Germany UFO sighting. On May 21st, 1994, around 11 p.m., a 39-year-old postal worker who preferred to use the pseudonym Mrs. H was relaxing and watching TV in her first-floor apartment. That evening, her daughter had gone out with friends, and Mrs. H was starting to get worried why her daughter was not home. Her daughter had gone to a nearby club, and Mrs. H decided to step out on her first-floor patio to look out and see if anything was going on. As she stepped out on her patio and looked over at the club, Mrs. H noticed something strange. In a small group of trees a few hundred meters away, one of the trees was swaying back and forth as if the wind was blowing. Even more strange, there was a bright white light coming from behind the trees. The witness then instinctively looked up and noticed a strange UFO around 100 feet in the air. The craft was silver and oval shaped, around 30 feet in diameter. The bottom part of the UFO had small dark squares that might have been windows. Under this, a circle of white lights rotated in a clockwise direction. The top of the craft had white lights too, but these were going counterclockwise. The witness watched the craft for around 1 minute, and then the UFO started to move to the left behind one of the buildings. At this point, the wind stopped blowing and the tree returned upright. Just a minute later, the craft reappeared and went behind the other building. At this point, the witness was extremely curious and ran toward the craft as it hovered and went out into the street. For the next 5 minutes, the witness, along with others, would watch the craft hover slowly down the street and then finally ascend up into the sky. That night, many in the apartment building would spot the craft as well. A young woman named Martina was sleeping that night when around 11 p.m. a phone call would wake her up. Martina's friend, who lived on the 3rd floor, had just spotted the craft and asked Martina if she had seen it. An angry Martina informed her she was sleeping and hadn't. Martina's friend asked to come up for a better view as Martina lived on the top floor. Martina angrily stated no and started to hang up the phone when she would hear her friend yell. As she put her phone up to her ear, her friend yelled, "It's circling back right toward your window." At this point, a curious Martina approached her window and opened the curtains. There, she would be stunned to see the large, shiny craft. It was silver-shaped, had rotating lights, and interestingly, was only about 5 feet from her window. A panicked Martina screamed and ran to her daughter's bedroom. She woke her up and the two hurried down the stairs to her friend's apartment on the 3rd floor. After a few minutes, Martina and her friend would head out on the 3rd floor balcony. Carefully, they went further and further out on the balcony until they were looking down on the craft. It was hovering in the same spot, just lower, and a strong wind blew in the woman's direction. Soon the craft would tilt on one side and hover out of sight. After this, the women called the police, who soon arrived. However, the craft was nowhere in sight. That said, the police would inform them that the police station had received many calls about the object. The next day, the local paper would run an article on the event. Like we see many times with these, the paper tried to explain the incident as a natural event. They stated the phenomenon was caused by reflections from the disco spotlights in the clouds. Still, there was more evidence that something extraordinary did happen. The day after the event, the women reported they had clothes out on the balcony drying like usual. On top of the clothes was some sort of black suit. Several other residents reported this as well, and many stressed this had never happened before. After the incident, most residents were able to move on with their lives. Martina, though, was still quite traumatized from that night. In the weeks that followed the event, Martina would report hearing strange noises, like footsteps around the apartment, and also seeing lights once again. She eventually became so scared, she moved out of the apartment. 1 year later, when MUFON, a UFO research organization, came to interview her, the investigators attempted to convince her to go back to the apartment building, but Martina was so terrified she wouldn't even go near it. MUFON then handed out questionnaires in the area about the event. Unfortunately, though, only one person completed it. He or she would confirm, though, many of the same details. Some think the response was so low because people didn't want to be antagonized. Others think people just wanted to move on with their lives. What can we make of this case? UFO sightings are not rare by any means. However, UFOs seen in major cities and flying among the high-rises are very rare. Probably the most famous case of this happening was the Linda Napolitano alien abduction, a case where a Manhattan woman stated she was taken from her New York City apartment in the middle of the night. Other witnesses stated they saw the craft that night, and also Linda levitating into the ship. The case was recently covered in a Netflix documentary. These types of cases raise all sorts of interesting questions around why these beings are in such heavily populated areas, and perhaps more importantly, why are they okay with being spotted? It appears the majority of the time UFOs are spotted in desolate areas, and often at night. There's a few theories on what they might be doing. The first is that the UFO wanted to appear invisible or camouflaged, but something malfunctioned, causing it to be visible. There are numerous reports of these crafts vanishing right in front of witnesses' eyes. This leads some to believe they do travel around heavily populated areas and observe what mankind is doing. We covered a case from Canada recently in which a hospital worker spotted a craft on top of another building. By all accounts, it seemed the UFO was having mechanical issues. A second theory from some is the UFO was doing some type of experiment as to gauge our reaction. This seems plausible, especially based on the behavior of the craft. One theory is that the craft was being piloted by a rogue operator. Could a disgruntled alien broken the rules and took its ship into a heavily populated area? Perhaps some beings want to come out of the shadows and connect with humans, but leadership will not allow it. One final theory is that when these crafts come into heavily populated areas, these are military craft, or perhaps a crashed UFO that is rebuilt by humans and operated by humans. Perhaps these are experiments run by the government to gauge the public's readiness to learn the truth. Whatever the reason or correct theory, with everyone having a camera at their disposal today, if it happens again and in broad daylight, we might finally get the smoking gun evidence we need. This could put immense pressure on governments, and then perhaps we will get answers about these beings, and more importantly, what they want. However, some are concerned that these questions might better be unanswered. On November 10th, 1973, a Dutch woman would wake up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. That night, she would peek out the window and see one of the strangest sights she would ever see. Several strange entities sweeping the road. While the case surely has the feeling of a vivid dream, or one person's imagination gone wild, two other cases around this time would be incredibly similar to her story. In this episode, we will examine the alien encounter of Anne Delphine, an incident that would later be labeled as the Street Sweepers of Uden. Founded in the 12th century, Uden is a town located in the province of North Brabant in the Netherlands. The small town has a rich history and has grown from a small rural town with incredible dark cherries to an important economic center in the country. Still, in 1973, one of the oddest alien encounters in the history of the Netherlands would occur. At 2:15 in the morning, Anne woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. Anne's bathroom was located on the far side of the home, and as such, Anne had to walk across the house to use it. She would pass by a set of windows on the front of the house, and out of the corner of her eye, Anne would spot something white out in the street. Being half asleep, she didn't think too much of it and used the restroom. After using the bathroom, Anne, who was now more awake, proceeded to walk back and once more saw the white. This time, though, she would stop. Anne looked out onto the street and spotted 3 figures wearing white robes. They were around 3 feet tall and appeared to be using some sort of device to sweep the street. Anne could see the being's feet, which were pretty big for their size. What was probably most strange, though, was the beings were walking in the same direction, but they weren't picking up their feet as they moved. It's like they were rolling slowly, or appeared to be waddling. The beings wore a white hood, which obscured their face, and wasn't tall or pointy, but the hood split off into 2 points that hung down from the back on either side, similar to a jester's hat. The beings continued to shuffle down the road, and Anne continued to watch them. The beings had a belt that had some different tools on it. It was a full moon that night, and Anne could make out the devices as they reflected off the moonlight. Still, the most odd detail of this case probably has to do with the devices that they held out in front. The beings all appeared to be carrying an object that looked like a metal detector or a vacuum roller brush. The beings were rolling the device back and forth, and to the left and to the right. Anne would continue to watch the beings for around 5 minutes. During this time, she thought about waking up her husband, but her spouse had been having heart problems, and she decided that it might be too much for him. After around 5 minutes, one of the beings would turn around and look directly at Anne. Anne couldn't see its face, but she had been made. The being turned around and communicated to the other something. A few moments later, the 3 humanoids quickly waddled away and disappeared behind a school. Anne, who was in shock, would continue to watch the street for several minutes, believing they might come back. After they didn't, Anne would decide to head back to bed. As she came in the bedroom, her husband appeared to be groggy and waking up. She was getting ready to tell him what she saw, when she would look out the window and see a red light. Anne estimated the red ball of light to be about 130 feet away and around 7 feet across. She looked at it, but it was so bright after a few seconds she had to look away. She then looked and said something to her half-asleep husband. She turned back around and the red ball of light was gone. She would proceed to tell him the story, and he would believe her, although he didn't see anything. Surprisingly, that night, Anne was able to fall back asleep. The next day, she would head to the police station and file a report. It's not clear if the police didn't believe her, or they just didn't care. But for an entire year, Anne wouldn't hear anything. After not hearing anything from the police, Anne decided to talk with her friend Bob Moyen about it. Bob would soon tell his son Edmund, who was a UFO enthusiast. Edmund would decide after hearing it that he should relay the story to the UFO community. As such, he wrote a letter to the Center of UFO Studies. In the organization, ufologists David Webb and Ted Blocher would take an interest in the case. Both men contributed significantly to the field of ufology. Ted Blocher, who was also an actor and singer, compiled the results of a historical study that documented all the reported UFO sightings during the 1947 flying disc craze. This study was released in 1967. Webb was an experienced UFO researcher and author as well. He would include Anne's story in his book, 1973, Year of the Humanoids, published in 1976. Still, the man probably most responsible for popularizing Anne's story was a Dutchman named Douwe Boska. Boska spent a year working for the organization, and after some time would return back home in 1978 to the Netherlands. Boska was very interested in Anne's case and would interview her several times. He would find Anne to be extremely credible and not one trying to seek fame or fortune. In fact, she had told very few the story in the past 5 years. While Anne did not seek the fame, it would soon come. Boska would begin telling UFO organizations in the Netherlands, like Nobova, and soon the story hit the press. Once it started, the story spread like wildfire around the country. Anne did do several interviews, but did so under the pseudonym Saskia Vermeulen. The journalist came to the interview expecting to find a good laugh, but all of them walked out believing Anne and her story. While Anne's account seems extremely bizarre and weird, the fact is, it really isn't. In fact, the next month there would be 2 similar cases that occurred involving beings sweeping or using a metal detecting like device on the street. The first occurred in the same month as Anne's, in 1974 in November. This story comes from the 1975 book, The Process of Flying Saucers, which was written by Claude McDuff. In this case, 4 Canadian women were driving from Sorel Tracy to Montreal for a night out on the town. As the women were heading into the city, they would spot an orb or ball of light over their heads. It would follow them for several miles over their car, and eventually a pink mist would come out of nowhere. Visibility was limited, and the women drove through the mist for what they perceived to be a matter of minutes. It's not clear if they experienced missing time, but what is clear is when they left the pink mist, a strange being was shuffling down the road with some sort of street sweeping device. In addition, the women would allege to see 3 men in black standing by a car on the side of the street. 1 month after Anne's encounter, another incident would occur. This occurred only 157 kilometers in the town of Villefort. This case we covered on this channel not too long ago. The story is as follows. On December 19th, 1973, a 28-year-old Belgian man awoke in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. After using it, he began walking back to his bedroom through the kitchen when suddenly he spotted a green glow coming through the curtains. The half-asleep man decided to peer through the window, and what he saw left him stunned. There was a 3-foot-tall humanoid walking around in his garden. The entity's outfit was different than what Anne described, as it was not wearing a robe. The outfit consisted of a one-piece tight-fitted suit that was emitting a greenish glow. It was wearing a transparent helmet, and a tube ran from the helmet to something on its back. Whatever was on its back was pretty big, covering the majority of it. However, just like Anne's case, the being appeared to be using some sort of metal detecting or sweeping device. As the man watched, the being placed 1 foot flat on a wall and began walking up it. The odd sight was truly unbelievable, as its gait stayed the same and the position of the metal detector device was the same as well. The being crested the wall, and soon a white light flashed beyond it. It seems that we have 2 cases with some similarities, and this is just from the same year. It should be pointed out too that Anne's case wasn't widely known at the time, so these don't seem to be copycat stories. Is this case, though, considered credible? As the case has become more popular over the years, so has the number of people who have examined it and scrutinized it. One individual that has studied the case has proposed an interesting theory that is worth looking at. In 1984, an amateur ufologist sent a letter to the Journal of Study Group for Foreign Air Phenomena proposing what he believed happened that night. The researcher's name was Mr. Moss, and his theory is quite popular with skeptics. Moss, who alleged to study the case extensively, stated that he used to live on a street similar to what Anne lived on. More specifically, the road was covered in stone and had been recently paved. Moss goes on to state that one night he was looking out his window when he would see several men exit their vehicle and begin using some sort of metal detecting device on the street. A curious Moss headed outside and asked what they were doing. One of the men informed him they were looking for gas leaks under the road. Why were they doing it at night? Less gas being used meant the pressure in the pipes was lower, and a gas leak could be detected easier. In addition, very little traffic at night as well. After Moss's letter, the story seemed like it had been solved. Or had it? Nobova, the UFO organization, took the theory seriously and even reached out to Obergas, the energy provider at the time. However, they didn't keep records that far back. Others weighed in as well. Bram Rosa, a UFO researcher, stated he didn't believe gas sweepers were widely used in 1973, and it wasn't done at night. While Moss's theory is an interesting one, it doesn't address several key questions. First, why were the individuals so short? Second, why would the gas sweepers be wearing robes? Also, how does he explain the red orb Anne saw? Why were they shuffling as if their feet had not lifted off the ground? It should be pointed out too, Anne watched them for around 5 minutes, and this just wasn't a quick glance. The second theory on this case is, of course, Anne saw some type of extraterrestrials, possibly collecting samples. In sum, it seems this is a credible case. Anne appeared to be a highly reputable witness by all who spoke with her, even the media. In addition, she even used an alias, which showed she wasn't in it for the fame. There are also at least 2 additional cases with entities using these sweeping devices for whatever reason. Thanks for watching, and please let us know your thoughts on this case, and if you know any cases involving these odd sweeping devices. In the middle of the night in February 1990, a Ukrainian man would wake up in the middle of the night to his dog barking. He rushed outside, and what happened next would be one of the oddest and most detailed alien abductions in the history of Ukraine. The man would allege to be taken, visit several alien planets, and also converse with dead relatives. In this episode, we will cover this unbelievable story, the alien abduction of Ivan Nikolaevich. In Donetsk, Ukraine, around 1:15 in the morning in February 1990, 68-year-old Ivan Nikolaevich was woken up in the middle of the night to his dog barking. Ivan, who lived alone on a farm, got dressed and ran outside into the yard. As he got out in the yard, he would be stunned to see several gigantic humanoid beings around 9 feet in height, wearing some sort of protective suit over their body and head. Ivan was terrified, turned around, and began running away. However, after taking just a few steps, he tripped and fell onto the ground. Next, the beings would hypnotize him, and Ivan would stand and begin walking toward them and following them toward their craft. Ivan would later recall he knew he was under their spell because he left the home unlocked and several gates open, something he never would do. As he walked toward the craft, he could make out that it was round, shiny, and around 40 feet in diameter. It was bluish gray, and Ivan was so scared at the time, he didn't pick up many other details. He climbed up a ladder and immediately smelled the inside, which he said smelled like violet. Inside, the humanoid suits would peel off, and he would now see there were 4, 2 appearing as women and 2 looking like men. Ivan stated the aliens' faces looked human, but their noses were flat, their eyes were large and round, the beings had small mouths, and ears smaller than a human. They had hair similar to a human as well. Ivan would point out the females both looked gorgeous. They had beautiful faces, with cropped short hair. It's important to point out here, it's possible they looked different, but might have manipulated Ivan's thoughts to make him believe that was what they looked like. This will become more evident as we dive further into the story. After this, the 2 females would undress Ivan, and a series of medical experiments would begin. They listened to his heartbeat and also placed something that looked like electrodes on his chest. These provided details on his organs, and as they worked, they communicated in a strange manner, making noises similar to a dolphin. In sum, the experiment did not appear to harm him or cause discomfort in any way. Ivan was then communicated to that he could leave. As he started climbing down the ladder, though, he would once again hear the strange chirping. The beings were discussing something, and all of a sudden one of them grabbed his collar and pulled him back up into the ship. Ivan proceeded to another room, and there he would sit down. The craft would then take off, and an astonished Ivan would look out the window as it ascended, and he was soon looking down at Earth. The craft took off at a high speed, and Earth soon became just a speck. Amazingly, he later recalled when flying away, he didn't feel anything in the UFO. He got up and walked to another room. This was a control room, and there was a massive screen, about 10 feet by 10 feet. He could see the ship passing by what looked like planets. There were a number of controls and panels being monitored by these giant beings. Perhaps what intrigued him the most, though, was there was a system that detected asteroids and space debris, and it allowed the craft to easily move around it. At this point, his fear began to dissipate as he realized the entities weren't going to harm him. After some time, Ivan fell asleep, and when he woke up, he would be stunned to see the craft was preparing to land on an alien planet. The beings approached Ivan and began putting a spacesuit on him. His suit had a number of hoses going around it and a window to see out the front. Ivan stepped out following the beings, and soon his attention would be drawn to something strange. There were beings standing out in an open field with a river running through it. These entities weren't scared of the craft. The humanoids were small, about 3 feet in height, and had childlike faces which were round. Probably the most strange aspect of these entities, though, was they had fur on their backs and also possessed wings. Still, Ivan didn't see them flying, and after a short time the beings communicated to Ivan to get back on the ship. Once on, he was invited to sit down and eat with the ETs. Several females cooked the food, and Ivan would later recall that their food was delicious. After eating, Ivan would have a few drinks, and the beings would visit several more planets. There didn't appear to be anyone living on these planets, though, as Ivan didn't see any humanoids. This planet was covered primarily by stones and appeared rocky. Ivan got back on the craft once again, and the UFO continued flying through space. The craft would pass a planet covered in all water. In a few minutes, Ivan would see a planet covered with smoke. The beings decided to touch down on the surface. There, Ivan would get out once again and would see a civilization destroyed. There were bones, and all the homes were destroyed. He could see animal bones as well, with many of the bones being gigantic, around the size of dinosaur fossils. Ivan knew something terrible had happened here, and hoped it wouldn't happen on Earth as well. It's not clear if the beings were trying to convey a message here, possibly around the dangers of war and nuclear weapons. Once again, Ivan would get back on the craft, and once again, he would visit another world. This one was nothing like the prior one. This planet was absolutely gorgeous, with breathtaking views, clear skies, and dense forests. There were lots of animals, but no people. Ivan would ask the beings if any of the same animals from Earth were here. They responded no, but stated there were some ones quite similar. After this, once more, they got back on the craft, and next, they would visit the aliens' home planet. As they arrived, Ivan would see the 2 females exit the ship, and he wouldn't see them again. The males would ask Ivan to come with them, and he would soon be taken to something that resembled a church. There, he saw both old and young beings that were singing. He would soon exit the church and see the homes of the beings. In addition, according to Ivan, they all had some sort of flying device that they could use to get around, but most didn't use it because they preferred to walk. Ivan would state the planet was gorgeous, clean, and it smelled like flowers. Based on what he saw, he believed the beings lived much longer than us, albeit death did exist. This is because he witnessed something that resembled a graveyard as he walked through the town. Ivan would later recall in their culture, a common practice was for beings to give food to one another. He was given a fruit-like object that looked like an apple. He would later try to bring it home to support his story, but one of the beings noticed and stopped him. Still on the planet, the being would take him to some sort of factory, one that processed something that looked like yogurt. The entire factory was automated, with the exception of one being who monitored everything. After this, Ivan would be taken back to the craft, and it departed for Earth. After leaving, it would make one more stop before returning to Earth. The craft landed on a strange planet covered with dense fog. Ivan departed the UFO in his spacesuit once again, and soon would hear a familiar voice calling his name. He turned around and would be stunned to see his 2 sisters, Zina and Nadia, both who died years ago. They both appeared as Ivan last remembered. They would tell him his fathers and grandfathers lived and were somewhere on the planet. Ivan wanted to go and see them, but the beings informed him it was time to go. Before leaving, Ivan would hug his sisters and note later they felt human. He would also ask about his mother, to which his sisters said she was somewhere else. They went on to say she was being temporarily punished as she did not visit the graves of Zina and Nadia. After this, Ivan was taken back home. The snow in the area where the craft had landed earlier had all melted, and there was now a brown circle where it was. For days after the event, Ivan would be incredibly sick. He didn't eat for 3 days, and his whole body ached. What can we make of Ivan's story? Without question, it's an incredible one, and very tough to believe. Alien abductions, where individuals alleged to visit other planets, are somewhat rare, and in our opinion, some of the toughest ones to believe. This is because they usually feel like science fiction, and also because individuals bring back no evidence. That said, there are some well-known cases where individuals alleged to travel the galaxy with ETs. One example is the case of George Adamski. If these are true, this raises the question why the ETs would show humans their planet and also their spaceship. All this said, Ivan's case is surely an interesting one. On the morning of August 12th, 1983, one of the most famous alien encounters in the town of Aldershot, England would occur. This older case continues to be extremely controversial among ufologists and locals to the area. That said, this close encounter of the third kind is quite interesting and one that deserves examination. In this episode, we will explore the Alfred Burtoo alien encounter. Sometime after midnight on August 12, 1983, 77-year-old Alfred Burtoo grabbed his fishing gear and with his dog Tiny began heading down to the desolate Basingstoke Canal for some night fishing. After checking out a few spots, Alfred finally picked his fishing spot around 1 a.m. Then around 15 minutes later, Alfred would spot a bright light heading toward him. It settled down around 300 feet away, right next to the path next to the canal. After seeing the light, Alfred didn't think too much of it, as there was a military base just nearby. He poured himself a cup of tea and kept fishing, but soon things would get strange. First, Tiny began barking furiously in the direction of the light. Alfred, with eyes on the water, commanded his dog to stop, but Tiny wouldn't. Alfred then glanced over and saw 2 dark humanoid figures coming in his direction. He couldn't make out specifics on the beings at first, but Alfred wasn't too worried. This is because Alfred had a military background, and he initially believed the figures might just be coming to check on him. As Alfred smoked his cigarette, he began to make out more details on the figures. They kept approaching, and although he wasn't scared, he surely was becoming curious. The beings got closer and closer. Then, he would spot more details. They were around 4.5 feet tall, wearing green coveralls that covered their whole body. He would later recall there were no buttons or zippers, and it was as if the suit was molded to their bodies. Alfred couldn't see their faces, as the beings wore a green helmet with a black visor. The entities would get around 5 feet away and stop. Both stared at Alfred for several moments, while Tiny continued barking. Then they gestured to him to come along. Alfred would begin following them toward the light. One being walked in front, while another one walked behind him. At this time, Alfred was more curious than scared. He would later recall that some of this had to do with his military training, and some of it had to do with his age and failing health. As he approached the ship, which rested in the air, Alfred would climb the stairs along with the beings. As he entered the room, he had to duck down slightly as to not hit his head. The room was all black and had 8 sides and was warmer than the outside. It had a foul smell, which Alfred compared to rotting meat. As he looked around, he would spot no bolts or screws in the walls, and it appeared to be smooth all over. During this time, Alfred could see the beings out of the corner of his eye. Then he heard some sort of noise, and the beings disappeared behind the wall. It's not clear if they just went through it, or a silent door just slid open, but now Alfred was standing in the room, all by himself. After a few minutes, in the middle of the room, a large shaft rose up from the bottom. Right next to it were 2 more beings, almost identical in appearance to the first 2. The shaft was large, around 4 feet in circumference. Then Alfred would be instructed to come over and stand under the light. He couldn't see any light, though, in the room. He stepped over to the right, and an amber light was right on him. It was glowing from ceiling to floor. He stepped into the light with no hesitation. While the light was shining on him, one of the beings would ask his age. Alfred responded that he would be 78 at his next birthday. He was instructed to turn around, and once he did, the being said, "You can go. You are too old and infirm for our purposes." Somewhat surprised, he left the craft and went back to his fishing spot. There he would grab a sip of tea and notice about an hour had passed. Alfred alleged to be unfazed by the experience and got back to fishing. As he was doing this, he would hear a noise from the craft and also see a bright white light. The craft then shot off into the night sky. Shockingly, Alfred would continue to fish all night, and then around 10 a.m. several policemen would walk by. He would mention the craft in his experience, and astonishingly, one of the policemen didn't seem surprised and even mentioned it was probably here to check out the military base. As the weeks progressed, Alfred found himself thinking more and more about that night in his experience. He wasn't sure of many things, but he did want answers. In October of that year, he decided to reach out to the local newspaper, the Aldershot News, in hope that someone else had seen the craft that night, or perhaps had had a similar experience. Alfred wouldn't find any other witnesses, but the event would draw the attention of several ufologists, such as Timothy Good, who would investigate the case. Good believed Alfred and thought he was telling the truth, although he wished that he would have tried to ask more questions to the beings. What can we make of this incredible story by Alfred Burtoo? Like many cases, there appears to be some things that make it seem genuine, while other aspects that make it seem fabricated. Many skeptics have questioned the story at hand. Some asked how Burtoo was able to remain so calm through the event. Also, what about his dog? It seemed to stay behind at the fishing spot, but some think the dog would have insisted on coming along. In addition to this, it's never good from a credibility perspective to wait months to report a story like this. This is somewhat of an unfair criticism, as it's understandable how people just want to move on with their lives. Still, Alfred was 77 and didn't seem to be scared of much. Several things in the story also align with other UFO reports. For one, the beings were near a military base. It's well documented, even in present day, that UFOs seem to get spotted near military installations. There's various theories on this, which include scary ones, like they are gathering intelligence data and assessing our defenses, and other ones suggesting they are just curious about our capabilities. One interesting case that has incredible similarities is the 1971 Finland forestry alien encounter, which we covered on this channel not too long ago. In that case, the being is described almost exactly the same way. The being in that case had green coveralls with a green helmet and a black visor. The only difference between these two cases, in terms of the beings, is that in the Finland case, the beings were described as 2 feet tall, while Alfred said they were around 4 feet. The Finland case happened 7 years before Alfred's encounter. Alfred alleged in the encounter the beings didn't want him because of his declining health. This is something we've seen in other cases as well, and not too surprising. Alfred had mixed emotions on this decision by the beings, though, as a part of him wanted to travel through the universe and get to do things few have done. With his declining health, Alfred would die several years after the encounter. There's rumors that a strong military presence now controls the area where the event occurred. It's reported to be tough to get into and out of, and some speculate the military has recovered crafts or possibly been in contact with the beings. Of course, none of this is known for sure. While we might never get the answers we want in the Alfred Burtoo incident, it surely is an interesting case to examine. On April 18th, 1961, around 11 a.m., Wisconsin resident Joe Simonton was sitting down and eating a late breakfast when he would have one of the weirdest alien encounters in history. At the time, Simonton resided in the town of Eagle River and was working as a chicken farmer. As Joe was eating, he would suddenly hear a strange sound outside. It sounded like a jet being throttled back, and Joe would later describe it as sounding like knobby tires on wet pavement. Joe quickly headed outside and was stunned to see a UFO drop out of the sky. The craft was silver, 12 feet tall, and around 30 feet in diameter. Joe noted it was incredibly bright. He would later state it was brighter than chrome. On one edge of the craft, there were what appeared to be exhaust pipes around 6 inches in diameter. The craft continued descending and would land. Then nothing could prepare Joe for what happened next. A hatch would open on the side. He would spot 3 beings. He described them as having dark skin and looking Italian. They were around 5 feet in height and weighed around 125 pounds each. He aged the being as somewhere between 25 to 30 years old. The beings wore dark blue uniforms and had turtleneck collars. They also wore helmets and were clean shaven. The visitors would next communicate with Joe through telepathy. They had a silver-shaped jug that was around 12 inches tall and had 2 handles. Joe stated the jug seemed to be made of the same material as the craft. The beings would communicate to Joe that they needed or wanted water. They handed the jug to him, and Joe would state the jug was absolutely beautiful. The strange metal-like material weighed less than steel, but more than aluminum. Joe left the beings and headed down to the water pump he had in his basement. After filling up the jug, he went back up, still in awe of it. As he got to the craft, Joe had to lean against it to hand it back, and he would get a better look as to what was happening inside the craft. In it, it was black, and there appeared to be 3 multicolored instrument panels for driving the ship. Most oddly, though, he noticed that one of the beings appeared to be grilling something that resembled pancakes. One of the beings would notice Joe seeing the pancakes and grab 3 for him. The pancakes were small, about 3 inches in diameter, and perforated with small holes. After the being, who Joe thought was the leader, handed him the pancakes, he touched his forehead, and what Joe would later interpret was the being's way of showing gratitude. The leader then closed the craft. It would rise up about 20 feet and then instantaneously shot off to the south. It was such a powerful blast of air that it bent the tops of the pine trees in the nearby area. Next, Joe would try one of the pancakes. He would later state it tasted like cardboard. The other 2 pancakes he gave to Judge Frank Carter. Carter would send the pancakes off to be tested. He sent them to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, or NICAP. NICAP, though, refused to test them. This upset Carter, who wanted to give a lecture on the experience. Carter was said to be an avid UFO enthusiast. Despite NICAP not wanting to get involved, the case drew the attention of J. Allen Hynek. During this time, Hynek was an astronomer at Northwestern University. After studying many cases and investigating them, he became convinced that UFOs are real. This would lead him to find his own group to study them. The group would even take over NICAP's files after they went under. Hynek would investigate many cases, such as the Red Bluff UFO incident and also the Lonnie Zamora case, both of which we covered on this channel. Most notably, though, he created the Hynek classification system, which is still in effect today. This is the Close Encounters scale. Hynek would push to get the strange pancakes tested. A group of scientists from Northwestern and the Air Force's Technical Intelligence Center analyzed them. The group would discover them to be made of elements of this planet. More specifically, the pancakes were made of flour, sugar, and grease. The Air Force would investigate the other aspects of the case and conclude the following. Simonton answered questions directly, did not contradict himself, insisted on the facts being exactly as he stated, and refused to accept embellishments or modifications. He stated he was sure that we wouldn't believe him, but he didn't care whether he was believed. He stated simply that this happened, and that was that. Interestingly, the report also stated the only flaw is the disappearance of the craft in 2 seconds. This is really odd for a number of reasons, most notably because in so many cases witnesses report seeing craft flying off at incredible speeds. Sometimes they fly so fast that some witnesses report the craft disappearing into thin air. Other Air Force personnel would investigate Joe as well. Some believed him, while others thought he may have hallucinated the event due to an injury. One interesting theory comes from Lloyd Malin, who wrote a book titled The UFO Handbook for Air Force Personnel. Malin stated the Air Force investigated one popular rumor that swirled in the community that was published by Raymond Palmer, the publisher of Pulp Flying Saucer and several other science fiction magazines. Palmer wrote that Joe was hypnotized by someone who was hired by a local real estate agent and given the pancake story. This was done so he would repeat it and be able to bypass any sort of lie detector. The hope from the real estate agent, according to the rumor, was that it would draw attention to the area and boost business. Still, most look past Palmer's theory due to the reputation of Palmer. Palmer was considered somewhat of a nut job even in UFO circles. For example, one of Palmer's beliefs was that UFOs came from a secret Hollow Earth civilization ruled by a race called detrimental robots, which he called Deros. Palmer believed the Deros manipulated humanity with some sort of rays he called thought rays. Palmer was said to have only one source for his theory, and it came from the memory of a Pennsylvania welder. While there weren't any other witnesses that saw what Joe saw, one interesting account comes from someone in the area. About the same time Joe was visited, a local insurance agent named Savino Borgo was driving along Highway 70 about a mile from Joe's farm. According to Borgo, he saw what he later described as a flying saucer rising diagonally into the air and flying parallel with the highway. What can we make of the Joe Simonton case? By all accounts, Joe appeared to be very credible and also told the story in a consistent manner. He was interrogated by not only military officials, but also local police, many who knew Joe for decades and said they believed him and that he was also very reliable. The story of Joe Simonton is surely an interesting one for a number of reasons. First and foremost are the pancakes he was given. While they appear to be of terrestrial origin and made from ordinary ingredients, that's not definite proof that this encounter didn't happen. Joe kept the pancakes, and if he did try and fabricate the encounter, why would he send them off so they could be tested? The pancakes seem to support the theory these beings were biological in nature just like us, needing energy. This leads to the next strange aspect of this case, the water jug. Why would the beings need such a small amount of water, and couldn't they get this water themselves? As many have joked on the case, maybe the pancake batter was too thick. Cases where beings need water, though, are not unheard of. On this channel, we covered a close encounter of the third kind, called the Udo Wartina case. In that case, the witness reported the craft landed next to a river, and several hoses came out of the ship, sucking up the water. It's not clear why they needed the water, though. One other intriguing aspect of this case is the beings. Usually when people report encounters with aliens that are human-like, they're Nordics. Nordics have blonde hair, blue eyes, are tall, and are known for being physically attractive. These beings, though, Joe described as Italian-looking. This is not something seen that often. The encounter itself seemed to be amicable, although some have stated they believe the pancake was actually some sort of scientific experiment. Did it contain some sort of ingredients that were put in Joe's system to track him? Many don't think so, as they believe they wouldn't actually need to do this. While the most popular theory is that this was ETs, some have suggested this was a military experiment. The beings appeared human, but not Nordics. Also, the pancake ingredients were of this planet. Perhaps the military was testing something with the pancake. In general, this case surely is an odd one, but one that surely deserves attention. Unfortunately, there was only one witness to the event, although he sure seems credible. It said Joe had more encounters after this, which isn't that unusual. Unfortunately, the attention and constant harassment from his story seemed to deter him from reporting more encounters. On May 20th, 1967, around 10:15 p.m., a 51-year-old man stumbled into Misericordia Hospital in Winnipeg, Canada. The individual was extremely sick and had been constantly vomiting the last few hours. The hospital staff began helping him, and as they opened his shirt, they noticed some strange burn marks. No one knew it at the time, but the individual, Stephen Michalak, had just had one of the most famous UFO sightings in the history of Canada. In this episode, we will dive into this popular close encounter of the second kind, an incident now known as the Falcon Lake Incident. On May 19, 1967, Stephen Michalak, a mechanic, departed his home in Winnipeg to Falcon Lake in order to search for silver and quartz. Stephen was an amateur prospector and had had some good luck the prior year staking some claims. On the evening of May 19th, Steve checked into a motel on the Trans-Canada Highway with plans to wake up early the next day and head into Whiteshell Park. The next day around 5:30 a.m., Stephen departed the motel and arrived in the park around 9 a.m. He soon settled near a stream and got to work studying the quartz formation. At 11 o'clock, Stephen ate lunch, and then at 12:15 p.m., Stephen heard a flock of geese honking, so he got up and turned around. Then he would see them. Up in the sky, there were two red, glowing cigar-shaped UFOs around 150 feet away. What happened next was something really interesting. The objects descended, and as they did, their shape seemed to change as well. They went from being cigar-shaped to oval-shaped to finally disc-shaped. One craft remained hovering, while another landed on a rock about 150 feet away. At the time, Steve began sketching the crafts. Then the UFO hovering began to ascend. Like we see from time to time, the colors on the craft change, going from red to orange to finally gray. In just a few moments, the craft disappeared somewhere in the clouds. Still, the other craft remained, and it had changed colors as well, going from a red to a silver color with a faint gold light around it. The craft was giving off a sulfur-like smell and made a buzzing sound, something we see in a number of cases. For around 30 minutes, Steve watched the object and even sketched it. He believed it was a military craft and decided to remain where he was. Then a door opened on the side of the UFO, and Stephen began to approach. When he got within about 60 feet, he heard, or believed he heard, human voices. He kept walking toward the 35-foot craft and spoke out in English, attempting to communicate. There was no response, though. He would try as well in several other languages, like German and Russian, but to no avail. Finally, he reached the craft and decided to peek inside the open door. There were many various colored lights inside flashing, but he didn't see anyone, human or alien. He then stepped back out of the craft, and unexpectedly, the door closed. At this point, Steve took notice of the craft. There were no screws or any type of seam anywhere. It was just one smooth surface. Curious, Steve, who was still wearing his protective gear, reached out and touched the UFO, and it melted his glove. Then the craft spun somehow, and some type of vent was in front of him. It was about 9 inches high and 6 inches wide and had round holes. Unexpectedly, a blast of air or gas shot out from the vent, setting his shirt and undershirt on fire. In pain, Steve scrambled to undress and put out the fire. Meanwhile, the craft began to ascend, and just like the first craft, it changed colors in the same fashion. Steve continued to smell the sulfur-like smell, and soon he became violently ill. He felt nauseous and started breaking out in cold sweats. He quickly decided it was time to head back to the motel. On his way back, he threw up several times. Soon he reached the highway and would be stopped by Constable G.A. Solotki of the Falcon Beach Highway Patrol. It was around 3 p.m. at the time, and Stephen warned the officer to not get too close, as he believed he had radiation poisoning. He kept his shirt in his briefcase for this reason. Stephen would go on to tell the officer his story, and as we will see, reports seem to vary as to what happened next. The police report indicates that Constable Solotki believed Stephen might be drunk, albeit he did not smell alcohol on him. He also thought it was strange he had no prospecting equipment, although it's reasonable to assume, being so sick, he just left it behind. Perhaps where the accounts differ the most significantly is whether the officer was willing to help. According to the police report, Solotki offered to take him in for medical treatment, but Stephen refused. By some accounts, the officer was reluctant or unwilling to help him, and that's when he moved on. Also, another point of disagreement seems to be around Steve answering his questions. According to critics, Steve was unwilling to answer many of the constable's questions, leading some to theorize he was hiding something or lying. Of course, according to Steve, he believed he had been exposed to radioactive material and was just trying to protect the man. While we don't know for sure everything that happened in the interaction, we do know that Steve soon got on a bus that evening and headed back to Winnipeg. His son would meet him at the bus terminal in Winnipeg and take him to the hospital. There, he was treated for first-degree burns. After being discharged from the hospital, Stephen contacted the Winnipeg Tribune and told him his story. The paper ran the story, and soon it spread like wildfire around the country. Just 3 days after the event, the APRO would show up to Steve's house to talk with him. In addition, that same day, the police would show up too and noted his burnt hat and damaged welding goggles. At this point, Steve was still very sick and had lost 13 pounds in 3 days. The vomiting had not stopped, nor had the nausea. Many would visit him from various branches of the government, as well as reporters. Some believed him, while others didn't. Perhaps the most notable encounter happened with the Air Force. On May 26, Air Force officials showed up at Steve's door demanding to know where the landing site was. Stephen initially refused, stating he didn't want to make his prospecting spot public. Still, officials took his soil sample and tested it, and it was found to be highly radioactive. Realizing how dangerous the situation had now become, Steve decided he needed to show the Air Force the landing spot. Once he took them there, authorities noted the burnt moss. Reports vary here, with some stating significant amounts of radiation were not found, albeit there were traces of it present, while others state the area and objects were found to be very radioactive. It seems many of the objects were passed around different government agencies and eventually lost, leading to more questions. In January 1968, Stephen's burns would return. As a result, the Winnipeg Tribune decided to run a story on it. In the story, the paper would publish what is perhaps the most famous photo of a close encounter of the second kind in human history. Stephen is shown laying in a hospital bed with burnt grid marks in his chest. It's important to note this photo has been highly criticized by skeptics. In fact, many sources have dated this photo to be from May 1967. However, the burn marks from 1967 seem to be different, larger, and more circular. There is more to the story than this, though, and we will examine this argument from skeptics in just a moment. Still, what can we make of this case? Is it credible? In our opinion, it seems more likely than not this event happened, albeit it's not as credible as many other cases we have covered. To begin, let's examine several of the skeptic arguments. The first and weakest seems to be that Stephen was drinking or hungover and that he simply created the story. Several hotel employees alleged to have seen him drinking a few beers the night before. Stephen did deny this, but even if he had some beers, who cares? His interaction with the cop didn't suggest that he was drinking. The second criticism comes from critics, and that is that Stephen created the story in order to prevent others from finding his prospecting spot. This argument is flimsy at best as well. This is because creating a story like this would just attract more people to the area. In addition, Stephen's health was terrible, and this caused him to lose valuable prospecting days. The third claim from skeptics is that Stephen created the story for fame and fortune. This isn't a terrible argument, as Steve did contact the papers and also wrote a pamphlet on his experience. Still, it is our opinion he was negligent as to what would happen to him and his family. He was trying to let others know what happened to him so they wouldn't have to go through the same experience he did. The final argument from critics is around the burns. The first is that the burn pattern from January 1968 appears to be different from the May 1967 photo. In our opinion, this is the strongest argument from critics. However, like critics do all too often, they leave out details. Initially, the red blotchy marks appeared, but then several days later, they turned into the gridiron burn marks and matched the 1968 photo. It's important to point out too that Steve's shirt had the grid burn marks on them as well, and there's photographic evidence of this. Also, this raises the question, if the burns were so different, and if Steve fabricated the story, why would he go public with this second set of burns? It really doesn't make sense on the surface. All this said, there are some legit reasons to believe Stephen. First off, he was a Polish immigrant worker, and it seems tough to believe he would be able to trick so many people. The case was investigated by many, and other than the burn photos, nothing else seems to suggest he created the story. The second reason was Steve's health. Without question, Steve had horrible burn marks and was violently ill for some time. It's tough to imagine that he would purposely burn and injure himself for a little bit of fame. After all, Steve was on the brink of some big prospecting discoveries. It makes sense that he would want to be out in the woods searching as much as possible. The final thing to support Stephen's story was the radiation found. With the soil sample, it was found to be highly radioactive, and this was the government testing it, not a researcher hired from a UFO organization. That said, many will criticize and state there was just trace radiation on the site, but it's surely possible this was covered up. More evidence seems to come from Steve's son, who wrote a book on the topic. He recalled his experience seeing his dad in bed at age 9. He would state in his book, "When I walked into the bedroom, there was a huge stink in the room, like a horrible aroma of sulfur and burnt motor. It was all around, and it was coming out of his pores. It was bad." His son would also state, "If Dad hoaxed this, remember, we're talking about a blue-collar, industrial mechanic. If he hoaxed it, then he was a freaking genius." In 1999, Stephen Michalak died, never wavering on his story. On February 6, 1970, Canadian police officer Bob Crawford was dispatched to settle a domestic dispute in St. Catharines, Ontario. Officer Crawford arrived at 237 Church Street, apartment 1, and quickly settled the dispute. As he was leaving the apartment, another resident in the building frantically approached him. The woman pleaded for Crawford's help in her apartment, and he obliged. He didn't know it at the time, but Crawford was about to experience the strangest case of his career. In this episode, we will examine the frightening poltergeist of St. Catharines, Ontario. As Officer Crawford walked in the woman's apartment, he was astonished to see it was a complete disaster. Furniture was overturned, picture frames were broken, and there was a complete mess all over the floor. What he was told next would truly shock him, though. The woman who stopped him, named Barbara Page, informed him that the disarray was caused by some unknown force or ghost. Crawford decided to get more details, and he spoke not only with Barbara, but her entire family. Barbara had 2 sons, 11-year-old Peter and 8-year-old Mark. Her husband, John, was there as well. The family would tell him that the furniture had been moving by itself with no known cause. Perhaps even more bizarre, this had been happening the last 10 days. While Crawford was initially skeptical, he soon witnessed the paranormal activity himself. He saw a heavy dresser get knocked down by something. Crawford, convinced at this point, was unsure of what to do, so he called the Roman Catholic Church. He would speak with Father Stevens, and a short time later, Father Stevens would arrive at the Page household. Officer Crawford would be surprised to learn Father Stevens had been to the house just a few days earlier. Then, he experienced paranormal activity in the apartment. In particular, he saw a bed move away from the wall all by itself. Father Stevens pushed it back into place, and as he walked away, the bed moved back out again. The Page family was frightened at this point and was unsure what to do. Officer Crawford suggested everyone move into the living room to discuss options. As Crawford was walking out of the kitchen, he moved a chair under the table. While discussing what to do, the group would hear the eerie sounds of footsteps going across the living room. Everyone froze, and they listened as the footsteps went into the kitchen. Officer Crawford and Father Stevens then cautiously walked back into the kitchen. There, they would be shocked to see the chair had moved back out to the center of the room. A few moments later, police officer Bill Wire arrived. Wire was there to back up Crawford at the domestic disturbance call. When Wire heard about the events, he wasn't surprised though. Wire said just 1 month earlier, he had responded to a call from residents in the building. They complained of hearing odd noises all day and all night. Wire had the utility companies come out and investigate. However, nothing abnormal was found with their systems. Soon that night, Wire would eyewitness the paranormal activity himself. On a shelf sat a row of bowling trophies. Wire watched as they fell one by one off the shelf. He also noticed the hands on the kitchen clock being pushed around, seemingly by themselves. More supernatural activity occurred, and the officers speculated that it was tied to 11-year-old Peter Page. For instance, as Peter walked by, the officers noted how pictures would sway on the walls. After this, several times Peter was pushed up against the wall. Things would go from bad to worse for Peter, though, that night. As he sat in a heavy wooden chair, it suddenly levitated several feet off the ground and then threw Peter on the floor. The chair came down on him, and both officers had to lift it off him as it was so heavy. The activity continued all evening, with pictures falling off the wall, doors opening by themselves, and furniture levitating. The next day, Officer Crawford would stop by the apartment complex once again with Officer Richard College. Coincidentally, they were called over once again for a domestic disturbance report. That night, a man was arrested at the scene, and College would take him, putting him in the back of the police vehicle. As College was walking him to the car, a woman ran over to Officer Crawford and told him something bizarre was happening at the Page home. The woman informed him a bed was levitating by itself in the apartment. Crawford ran and grabbed College, and the 2 men rushed in the apartment. However, the bed had already fallen back down to the floor. In the apartment, the men talked with the Pages, and soon the paranormal activity would restart. It didn't appear to be as extreme as the night before, so the police left and informed the Pages they would check on them every night. Then, 5 days later, from when Officer Crawford first came to the home, the Pages would call the police. Several officers, as well as family of the Pages, showed up, and saw the paranormal activity. At this point, there were multiple witnesses to the event, and the story was soon picked up by the press. The newspaper in the area, named The Standard, wrote an article titled "Ghostly Presence in an Apartment" on Church Street. It detailed what was happening in the apartment, and the story spread like wildfire. More reporters, paranormal investigators, and others arrived at the apartment. The Pages didn't like the attention and eventually went to Montreal for a short time. Once the attention calmed down, they returned to their apartment. Interestingly, in Montreal, no paranormal activity occurred. In addition, when they returned, there were no more reports of supernatural behavior. The family never went public and never talked about the event. The records from this story come from other eyewitnesses, such as Officer Crawford, and newspaper reports. Despite the short duration of the haunting, this case is considered to be highly legit by paranormal investigators. This is due to the large number of independent witnesses, many whom are deemed very credible. In addition, the family avoided the spotlight and never tried to gain money or fame from the story. Over the years, there's been much speculation around this case. It appears by all accounts that this was a poltergeist haunting. The spirit displayed the classic symptoms of a poltergeist by disturbing objects and also never manifesting. In addition, one person seemed to be at the center of the haunting, Peter. It's not clear why the haunting abruptly stopped and why it was so short too. Still, other poltergeist cases have been very short like this, and sometimes cases can last for years. One other question concerns why it started in the first place. No reason has ever been discovered. The apartment complex would eventually be repurposed from residential housing to commercial housing. It exchanged hands multiple times, including being converted to a pizzeria. All tenants reported no strange activity, and it appears now whatever haunted this property has moved on.